So, welcome to the Royal Academy of Engineering Sciences. My name is Charlotte Andersson, and I will be your guide through this seminar today. And I am with you today from Luleå. And the seminar is Materials Enable the Green Transition. Can we manage the supply? So the climate crisis is a fact, and we are already in the green transformation. And step by step, the behavior of both companies and us as individuals, but also our society as a whole, is changing. We are moving from a fossil-based society to a more sustainable one. And in this movement, it's likely to demand more material. We can please change slide to the next one. So 300 years ago, most people in their daily life, they used very few number of elements. We had steel, so it was carbon and iron, of course. But for each century, with the progression, both the technical progression, but also improvements in both welfare and healthcare, the number of elements that we use in our daily life has increased rapidly. And today, many people in their daily life use a lot of elements, and also in our new technologies, and often in combination. And many of the emerging technologies that we use today are enablers. They're enabling this green transition. And it has been considered that access to resources is a strategic security question if Europe are to deliver the Green Deal. So in the next slide, you see a number of elements. And this is the list of critical raw materials. It was first presented in 2011, and then it contained only 14 elements. So a critical raw material is a material that has high importance and high supply risk. This list was then updated several times, and this is the latest version, and it now contains 30 elements. So where can we find these materials, these elements? We know there are some resources in Sweden, and many of these elements are already in circulation in products we use, for example. But we lack complete information of where they are, and are they in extractive waste or in products? So we don't know how much potentially is available for recovery or recycling. So the supply of materials is a key issue for our future society. So we are now, in these times, we're dealing with several questions of faith. We have the climate crisis, and on top of all this, we also have a pandemic. But once we resolve these, we will still have a need for materials, and in particular for metals. Metals is one of the cornerstones in our society today, and most likely in the future also. So today with us, we have a list of prominent speakers that will enlighten us, increase our knowledge, and answer our questions, and maybe pose some new ones. So this seminar, if you please, thank you, will touch upon this from 3 different aspects. Both the need for materials, mining, as well as discussion. If you have any questions that you're listening in, you can post them in the chat function, and I will ask the speakers during the seminar these questions so that you can interact with us. And you can scan the QR code for that. So with that, I will leave the floor, or maybe the digital space is more the right term, to our first speaker of today, Daniele Laporta, Senior Mining Specialist, Energy and Extractives at the World Bank Group, coming with us today from the US. And she will tell us more about minerals for climate action. So, welcome, Daniele.
Thank you very much. Good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you are. Very happy to be here today. Thank you very much for the invitation. I will share my screen now. There we go. I hope everybody can see my screen. Yes? Yes, so thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here today to present the Climate Smart Mining Initiative of the World Bank. So this work started back in 2017, when we published what was, I believe, the first real quantitative analysis that looked at what minerals and metals we would need if we were to meet our climate targets. So what did we really need in order to realize the renewable energy transition? So back in 2017, we published this first report, which then started, a series of other activities and other reports on the World Bank side. So for us, and this year was also important because we launched a new report, which is an update of our 2017 report, and it's what I will present to you today. So this new report goes a bit beyond just looking at the mineral intensity of the clean energy transition. It does also look at how the demand risk for each mineral changes depending on whether, it is used for one technology or across multiple technologies. So we wanted to understand, for example, as technologies change, what does that mean for mineral demand? We also did a bit of a deep dive into different low carbon technologies and how these technological improvements in material efficiency could impact mineral demand. We looked at the potential role of recycling and reuse in meeting the demand under the 2-degree scenario. And the reason we looked at that is because often when we presented the results of our reports, people would say to us, oh, but we don't need more mining. We're just going to recycle everything. So we wanted to, take a closer look at what role recycling would really play in meeting this mineral demand. And another thing we try to address in this new report is the carbon footprint of the minerals needed for the low carbon technologies, and we compare them to conventional technologies. And we wanted to look at that because also when we presented the findings of our report, our 2017 report, people would say to us, so we need all this mining in order to realize the low carbon future. So are we just, substituting, continuing to burn fossil fuels for more mining? So are we just shifting the problem from fossil fuels to additional mining? So we try to address that as well in the new report. And I will show you some of the numbers regarding that. So very quickly, I will not waste too much time on the methodology because we have, that in the report, but I'll be glad to take some questions at the end as well. But basically what we did in this new report was expand from the 2017 report where we looked at the International Energy Agency climate scenarios. And based on these scenarios, they have an outlook in terms of which technologies will be needed in order to meet the climate scenarios. For example, if we want to keep global warming at 4 degrees or at 2 degrees or what we agreed in Paris, how much solar, how much wind, how much battery storage will we need in order to meet these climate scenarios? So we took that and we looked at the composition of these technologies and then extrapolated in terms of how much material, what minerals and metals we will need in order to reach these scenarios. In this new report, 2020, we go a little bit beyond. We also looked at International Renewable Energy Agency scenarios. We wanted to, have something to balance and not just focus on the IEA scenarios. But the IRENA scenarios do not include storage. So the IEA scenario does goes a bit beyond in terms of including storage as well. And here, energy storage projections, and again, as I mentioned, only for the IEA scenarios, we wanted to understand exactly what storage scenarios we were talking about in order to meet, the climate targets. And we looked all the way until 2050 and what that meant in terms of mineral demand. So here is just to show you, because I know very often people try to understand our methodology and what we did, and this is just a very simple graph to explain what were the inputs that we had. This is just a bit of a summary of what I just mentioned, that we look at the energy, the IEA and the IRENA scenarios, and then we look at the composition of the technologies, and then as a final output, we have the total demand for metals for these renewable energy technologies. On the recycling, it's important to say that we extrapolated, we estimates of the current end of life and recycled content rates drawn from literature. We had to use some assumptions, and one of them is that we estimated end of life to 100% by 2050, just in order to be able to have a bit more of a realistic. We wanted to say, even, if we scaled up recycling to 100% end of life, what would that mean in terms of the role recycling would play in meeting this demand? And the recycling content rates were used to give estimates of primary and secondary demand. And I will go into a little bit more detail in terms of what this means and what the results were. As I mentioned, this report also looks at the global warming potential for these technologies. This was a very first attempt to try to put a number in terms of the carbon footprint of these technologies. So again, here, we looked at cradle to gate estimates of the global warming potential of these minerals. The data we used was the global warming potential per kilogram of mineral, and we drew that from the applicable literature. We had the implicit assumption is that the GWP per kilogram of mineral was constant over time, and where we used emissions data on steel, cement, and operations and fuel extractions were also drawn from literature. In our report, we had to put very clearly some disclaimers because there was not a lot of literature out there. The literature was thin, so but we felt that we needed to kind of try and address this concern regarding the carbon footprint of these minerals and metals. So the new finding of the report, it does not really change from the 2017 report. And basically what it says is that, the low carbon future is indeed very mineral intensive. And that if, the more ambitious we are in our climate targets, the more minerals and metals we will need. So here you can see the projected annual average demand for minerals up to 2050 under the IEA energy technology perspective scenarios. And as you can see, if we go beyond the 2-degree scenarios where we are even more ambitious in our climate targets, we will need 3.5 billion tons of minerals and metals. And I will break that down a little bit for you to try and understand what minerals and metals are we talking about. So demand will increase significantly for some minerals to achieve the 2-degree scenarios, as I mentioned. So on this graph, you can see that the highest increase in demand comes from graphite, lithium, and cobalt. And this is all relative to 2018 production levels. And this is predominantly coming from energy storage. So if we look at current, 2018 productions and we extrapolate that into 2050, we will see that based on the amount of energy storage we need, this is the amount of graphite, lithium, cobalt we will need. So it is quite significant. We have, a very significant demand for these minerals and for the others as well. I mean, you can see here, please remember that this is just for the renewable energy technologies. We're not talking about overall demand. So just to keep this in perspective. And on the right side here, we have the highest demands in terms of quantity produced will come from aluminum, where we have 87% of demand coming from solar PV. So this is the annual demand from these energy technologies in 2050. So as you can see here again, we have graphite, nickel, copper, zinc, a lot of these minerals and metals that will be so key and so fundamental in order for us to achieve our climate goals by 2050. So another aspect that we tried to address in this report is looking a little bit at what we call cross-cutting versus concentrated minerals. Some of these minerals and metals are going to be used in a wide variety of technologies, and the demand for them will not be restricted by technology. As you can see here, we're comparing copper, which is widespread, and it goes into every single technology out there, as opposed to graphite, where, the demand, the growth in demand will be very focused on energy storage. And why does this matter? It matters because we wanted to understand, if technology changes, would that impact demand, and how much so? And by this, I will go into the next slide, which provides what we are calling the demand risk matrix. So the demand risk matrix was really to try and help us understand, one, how much of that production was going to grow based on 2018 levels. And also it was about criticality in terms of how widespread the use for these critical minerals and metals is. So in quadrant one, it's the minerals and metals that are least impacted from demand, and they are somewhat, used in a variety of other technologies. Quadrant two gives us, those critical minerals and metals that we have a very significant growth in terms of demand, but they are also very concentrated in one or two technologies. So depending on where technological changes go, they will be very impacted. Quadrant three is high impact cross-cutting minerals. They're critical because demand from 2018 production levels increases significantly, yet their use is also widespread across technologies, and here we have aluminum. And the fourth quadrant is really important since it's used across a wide variety of technologies, and they're really not dependent on one specific technologies. So again, we wanted to understand that because for us at the bank, as we advise resource-rich developing countries, we wanted to help them understand the criticality of their resource. It was important to try to address this criticality. So this is one of the main findings of our new report. So, which leads us, yes, sorry, there was some background noise. So another finding from our report is the role of recycling in meeting the demand under the 2-degree scenario. And basically what we found, again, is that even if we do scale up recycling, even if we consider aluminum and copper from current products are recycled at 100% at their end of life, it still wouldn't be enough to meet mineral demand under the 2-degree scenarios. So we understand recycling will play a very important role in meeting demand, but primary production of these minerals and metals will still be needed in order to meet the demand under the 2-degree scenario. And apologies that I am rushing a bit through this, but it's a lot of content to cover. So the last finding of our report, as I mentioned, is the carbon footprint of the low carbon technologies. And we looked at the minerals needed for renewable generation and energy storage, and we found that they only account for 6% of emissions as compared to your conventional technologies. So it means that even though we do need a lot of mining to happen in order to meet the 2-degree scenarios, if we look at the climate, looking from a climate perspective, it is still much better than continuing with our current status quo of, our fossil fuel technologies. So for us, again, it was very important to understand where will all these minerals come from. For the bank, we wanted to ensure that, resource-rich developing countries had a role to play in meeting this mineral demand. We wanted to ensure that, they understood their resource, but also that they would be able to be one of the providers of these minerals and metals. It's great, but we don't want all of these minerals and metals coming from Canada or Australia. We wanted to ensure that Guinea or Gabon or Mozambique had a role to play in meeting this mineral demand. And for that, we created what we call the Climate Smart Mining Initiative. So basically what Climate Smart Mining does is support the responsible extraction, processing, and recycling of minerals needed for the low carbon technologies. And we want to do that by minimizing their climate and material footprints from extraction all the way to their end use. And we want to do that by scaling up technical assistance and investments in mineral-rich developing countries. So what does it mean? What will the World Bank do in order to help countries get there? And we have developed what we call the Climate Smart Mining Framework, which are these building blocks here. We have divided the building blocks into 4 main pillars: climate mitigation, climate adaptation, reducing material impacts, and creating market opportunities. So the idea is to look at the supply chain of these critical minerals and metals and apply this framework in order to obtain, a more climate smart mineral supply chain. So for example, under climate mitigation, we have here the integration of renewable energy into mining operations. This is key if we want to decarbonize the mining sector. But climate smart mining is not just about the carbon or greenhouse gas footprint. It's also about the materiality of these supply chains. So we had to look at waste management, for example. How do we better manage waste in these critical supply chains? As we all know, some of these minerals and metals, if you look at the current grade of some of these deposits, it's getting less and less. It's getting smaller. So we need to move more material in order to obtain the same amount of ore. So supply chains. It's about water. It's about, how do we improve the use of resources along these mineral value chains. Another one here worth mentioning is the forest smart mining. How do we, do mining better, and how do we impact less the forests around these mining operations? And I don't have time to go in detail into all of these building blocks, but it's just to give you an idea that we are looking at these mineral supply chains in a more holistic way, trying to understand the full impact of all the elements that come into play along these supply chains in order to obtain, a more climate smart mineral supply chain. So, as I mentioned, we have several other climate smart mining tools and knowledge. I just mentioned the report. We have a new report that was just launched yesterday that looks at the state of play of battery recycling and reuse and the potential for developing countries to play a larger role in the recycling and reuse of batteries. We have a report on the climate smart mining, on the forest smart mining, which is also available online for download. So we are slowly building our climate smart mining program, and we are doing so in partnership with the private sector and with governments. We have, as part of the Climate Smart Mining Initiative, the government of the Netherlands, the government of Germany, and on the private sector side, we have both Rio Tinto and Anglo American as founding donors of Climate Smart Mining Initiative, of the Climate Smart Mining Initiative. And we are also partnering with IFC, the International Finance Corporation, which is the private sector arm of the World Bank. So we really want to address these issues at the government policy level, but we also need to ensure that whatever operations are being financed with the climate smart mining approach. And that's it. Thank you very much.
So thank you a lot, Daniele, for that very nice presentation that has given us a lot more information about this. I have some questions to you then already now. This is very interesting. What would you say are the reactions? I mean, when you present this to, let's say, decision makers and politicians, and what is the general reaction? I mean, do they take action immediately, or how do they see this?
Yes. So back in 2017, when we first started putting out these numbers, people were very surprised because, again, we understood that there was a role for some of these critical minerals and metals in the clean energy transition, but people did not understand how much of a role and and the materiality of these technologies. So it was very surprising at the time. I think nowadays there's a better understanding, but it's still very, especially if we are talking to our climate stakeholders, there is still some resistance in terms of trying to understand and how to better manage all that. So yes, it has been challenging, but I think it's for us, it was also important to show that mining does have a role to play and is part of the solution, but we need to do mining better. I mean, it's very important for policymakers, for example, to understand that it cannot be business as usual. If we will need all these minerals to supply, the low carbon future, we will need to do it more sustainably. And that's what we are trying to achieve with the Climate Smart Mining Initiative.
So have you seen any effect on it yet? Have you seen now there is a policy that has come out, or are we still waiting for that?
No, we have seen results. For example, one of the tools that we have been using under Climate Smart Mining is what we're calling Climate Smart Mining Country Roadmaps. So what these roadmaps do, and Chile was the first one to prepare a roadmap, is that we use the Climate Smart Mining framework to look at these supply chains. For example, Chile looked at the copper supply chain, and they looked at where, they did a gap analysis using the Climate Smart Mining framework to try and understand where they were in terms of being climate smart. So they looked, for example, integration of renewable energy, where they stood, and then it helped set targets in order to where they wanted to be. And that also helped because they wanted to understand how they could better integrate mining into their NDCs, into their climate targets. So that's an important tool that we've developed under Climate Smart Mining. And we are now supporting Indonesia also in preparing their Climate Smart Mining roadmap.
So if you were to like choose, let's say now we have this mineral, or let's say an element that you would say like, okay, this is the most important. This is what we have to focus on now. Could you do that? Could you say that, okay, if you really is something that you need to, that is critical now? Or would it be a combination of several?
I think it's a combination. I mean, from the supply side, we know there are some minerals and metals that are going to be critical, and that we do not have enough projects in the pipeline in order to supply demand, like nickel, for example. That would be one aspect of it. But I mean, if we look at the supply chain of these niche minerals, there's still so much that needs to be done in terms of improving both the carbon and the material footprint of these supply chains. So I think it would be a mix of things. It's not just one specifically.
So you did this classification based on kind of what niche they are used in, and if they are several sort of technologies that are depending on them. And let's say batteries, for example, today, I mean, they have a certain composition today. Did you look into like these new emerging compositions, let's say for batteries, and see what materials would be critical for that? Is that something that you try to look into? I mean, I know it's a very difficult question.
It is a difficult question because we see, new technologies all the time. But we did look at the different technologies, at least the ones that were commercially more viable, like the ones that were a bit more sound. So we did look at that. We did try to understand, where these technologies were going. But for example, we did not want to look at technologies that, there has been a lot of talk, we're going to do cobalt-free batteries. For us, we understand that doing cobalt-free batteries does not help, for example, the DRC in any way. So we wanted to make sure that we were not, trying to look at these very radical views, but more consolidated technologies.
Thank you very much, Daniele. We will come back to this again in the discussion. So now Daniele has given us a very nice overview of this field. So now we say thank you, and I would like to invite our next speaker, Maria Åstrand, Managing Director, Raw Materials Northvolt. And she will tell us a bit about her company and how that is an enabler in this green transition, and how they work for a sustainable value chain. So please, Maria, I think you are in Stockholm, in IVA.
Yes, that's correct.
I give the floor to you.
That's correct. Can you hear me well?
I can hear you, so now I can see you as well. Thank you. Welcome, excellent. Maria.
Thanks a lot. So my name is Maria Åstrand. I work with Northvolt, and I worked with Northvolt for 2 years approximately. And the main purpose is to secure our metals needs, of course, for the future. And I do think that you might see also the presentation, I hope, in a way that you can see the presentation. Okay. So I would say that where do we come from in the beginning? And I think that this picture probably represents one of our biggest fears, and we share this fear, I think, all of us here in this meeting. And it's really where we're going with our climate. And as we heard just recently, I mean, there are many things that we need to do, of course, to achieve our objectives. But we do have solutions, we have technology, and we do have energy to actually change this trend, which we are seeing. So this is where we're coming from, and we believe that there are many solutions, of course, to make the future more clean. And I mean, energy as such, energy supply is changing, and also how we can store and how we can make energy into something useful. It's also something that is changing very rapidly as we speak. What we think at Northvolt, and especially me being in that part of the value chain which we are addressing today, the raw materials part, we truly believe that the raw materials is an enabler in this case to do this transition, to go to change the trend, or to change the negative development that we see regarding our climate and the environment. And of course, there are many different solutions. In Northvolt, we are not only targeting electrification of automotive, of course, we are also looking at other different applications where we believe that batteries can be useful. But our focus is for sure batteries. So, I mean, what we see, and there is so many different graphs and informations on where are we heading, what is the future demand looking like. And whoever can state that in a certain way, I guess, is wrong anyway. So we don't know. We know for sure it will increase. We know for sure that many companies all along the value chain is making new strategies to go more green. But we actually haven't seen the end of it. And I think that just recently we saw a really nice new car, not to mention maybe the maker, but a new car launching a really cheap and very long-range car, and this is the car for all the people. It's a little bit like the IKEA model, actually. So I think that it's going to be very interesting to see what these kind of products, if we call it that, will make for the demand. In this specific case, there is a demand saying that we would go to something like 3,500 gigawatt hours in need by 2030. And this is a number that you can see here and there, but you can also see bigger and smaller numbers in different forecasts, depending on the source. And we believe that lithium-ion batteries, being a fairly mature technology, is one of the parts that we will see part of this development. Of course, I mean, this is the demand, but in this graph you can see the capacity of battery manufacturing. And in this case, it's actually two graphs, so it's from Benchmark Minerals. And you can see something that was presented not so long ago. It was September 2018. And one that is just recently launched, exactly the same in the same report format from July 2020. And you can see only here that for sure, manufacturing is adopting, and manufacturing is being established to meet this future demand of 2030 and on. But it's not going fast enough, that is for sure. So clearly, the need is still not matching the forecasted supply. And this is where we come into play. So how does this affect the raw materials then? Well, this is a very easy graph. Clearly on the left side, you can see what we typically use in a lithium-ion battery. We have a few metals and materials listed. These are the ones that we are mostly interested in our battery chemistry. So it's a lithium-ion battery with an NMC cathode. On the right-hand side, it's the estimated metals demand relating to this. So it's a global demand, but for the battery metals. And as you can see, the change going from 2018 and forward to, I think it's at 2028, it's huge. So it's clear that we have a challenge to meet this demand on many different levels, not only from establishing manufacturing, but also making available the material from a permitting, from a political, and from a sustainability point of view. This is an example that I wanted to show only to sort of illustrate how crazy it can be if you don't look and think proactively on your supply chain. This is an example that is for nickel. And this is actually a real case, so it's really not how we want it to be in the future. In this specific case, you can see that the nickel has been mined. It's been mined in the New Caledonia. It's been shipped to France for refinement. And after that, it's made into a precursor material in Japan. And after it's been like that, it's put into a cathode material and shipped to US and installed into a battery. And from this battery, it's of course implemented into a car, and this car is then shipped to Norway. So you can see how this nickel atom specifically has been traveling all around the world. And what we in Northvolt think is really key going forward is to look, how can we secure local value chains, local sourcing, how can we support this infrastructure and this setting to be in place? Because shipping nickel metals or the other metals needed for a battery, it doesn't really make sense if we produce products that targets a greener future. So it doesn't really go hand in hand with our vision. So that leaves us maybe into Northvolt, and I guess some of you know Northvolt a little bit already, but just for your information anyway, for the full group, Northvolt is a very young company. We are founded 2016 by two persons, mainly Peter Karlsson and Paolo Cerruti, coming from Tesla, with a long background from industries of manufacturing and also car industry as such. They came to Europe and they saw that this ridiculous way of shipping material all over the world and not being able to source the metals and the materials to manufacture locally to feed our brilliant car industry in Europe, it doesn't make sense. So they decided to establish a European value chain in that sense. So our time frame is very tight, and of course we have very much that we want to achieve within a very short time. So since 2016, we have increased the company significantly. Today we are about 900 people. We have already established an R&D center in Västerås in the middle of Sweden. At the same site, we also developed something that we call Northvolt Labs. It's more or less a demo plant to manufacture products in small scale. And this is to be able to do all the learnings that is necessary to then go forward into a gigafactory. Presently, we are manufacturing 2 gigafactories, so one in the north of Sweden, where the water is tremendously available and making the energy source very green. And we are also building a gigafactory together with a partner, Volkswagen, in Germany. In addition to that, we also have something that we call module and pack manufacturing in Poland, Gdansk. And I think the next slide might actually show a map of that. So this is today the presence of Northvolt. And just recently we also launched a JV together with a Norwegian company called Hydro. And the purpose of this one is really to secure the recycling. So actually coming back to that later on, but one of the challenges with recycling is of course to get access to used batteries and cells. And by working together with Hydro in a country like Norway, which is really mature and advanced in terms of electrification of automotive, we believe that the availability of used cells and batteries will make this recycling industry fly. So we have a little bit of a different approach compared to many different other companies working in the battery industry. We think that it's key to be vertically integrated. So go all the way from, actually not from mining, but from manufacturing of the metals and the chemicals going into a cell. We go all the way from that into the full product being installed into a car, for example, or a mining equipment, or an energy storage on a, for example, a solar park. But we also care for the recycling. So in addition to this, we also want to secure that we are injecting these materials after they are not possible to use anymore. We re-inject them into our flow. And this is really something that we strive a lot to build and close this loop. And of course, there are many reasons for vertical integration. One is, of course, cost advantage. It's really beneficial to do this kind of setup. It's super ambitious, and honestly, it's also pretty tricky. To cover all these by just one company that targets to grow super fast. So you can imagine the challenge that we have with that. But it's also from a quality and a sustainability, like traceability point of view, very important. So by taking care of the materials from beginning to end, we have the possibility to secure that the quality of the raw materials that goes into the cell are the best that we can do. So we control the quality, and also we secure that the traceability of the materials are there. So it's really beneficial for us doing this vertical integration. So this is how it looks like. Actually, on the top right corner, that's how it looks like physically. On the lower left side, this is how the gigafactory in Skellefteå is going to look like. Within a very near future, we believe that we will produce our first cells in that factory next year, end of next year. So it's going really fast. It's going to have a capacity of a total 40 gigawatt hours of manufacturing. On top of that, we have the Northvolt 2, so that's the one in Germany together with Volkswagen. That is going to be approximately half the capacity. And of course, the manufacturing technology that we implement in these factories, I mean, they are top-notch. It's the latest state-of-the-art battery manufacturing equipment, and also enabling full traceability and full ability to steer the processes in a very autonomous way in these factories. So then we come into maybe a tricky question. What do we mean? We want to produce the world's greenest battery, but what do we mean with a green battery? For sure, it's important to remember that it's not only the energy that we use in these battery factories, even though it's super important that the energy is green, that it's sustainable and renewable, but it's also the manufacturing technologies that we use. So we want to secure that whatever technology we implement in our manufacturing is the most sustainable we can access at the moment. And also we do this all over the value chain. So sourcing the raw materials in a sustainable way and looking at the manufacturing processes of our suppliers, it's also very important for us. So we make a lot of due diligence of every partner that we partner up with. And logistics, of course, I mean, it's pretty obvious that shipping around cells or materials all over the world, it's not a sustainable way to do it. So also securing local value chains and enabling other partners and companies in Europe to be part of the value chain for the future batteries is also going to add substantially to the green of the batteries. So whenever we can, we want to source locally. Presently, it's not really possible because clearly we don't have this kind of industry established in Europe, but for sure, with a little bit of perspective, it will be there in Europe. So this is just an example of showing how massively we can reduce the carbon footprint of a gigawatt hour or a kilowatt hour in this case, by just securing local value chains and local sourcing and the most green manufacturing processes. So it's really making a difference in terms of carbon footprint of the products. And then we talked about the recycling. Clearly we want to go and do more and more recycling of these batteries as well. And we just established this joint venture with Hydro. We had just established a very small pilot plant in Västerås to secure processes for recycling. And some metals are pretty straightforward and easy to recycle. Some metals are less easy to recycle. And clearly we have to develop methodologies and processes to make that better and better for all the battery elements that we have. So this pilot plant is really key for us to co-develop with partners. And here we work with academia, really building knowledge in this area. So it's super important. Our target is that our cells, all the manufacturing that we will have 2030, and we are targeting approximately 150 gigawatt hours by 2030, 50% of the materials we use in our cells 2030 will come from recycling. So that's our pretty ambitious goal. So now we just need to secure how to get that in place. And as mentioned, the JV that we established is really a very important key for us to enable that. But recycling is not enough. There's not enough metals, battery metals in the system as it is. So I think I just stole a quote from Lucy Crane on a very inspiring TED Talk. If you haven't seen this one, I advise you to look at this. What hasn't been grown, it has to be mined. And for sure, these metals are not in the system, let's say, of recycling and metal system yet. So for quite some time from now and on, we still need to find virgin material to mine material to get to the ambitious goals we have when it comes to electrification. Then I wanted to give an example on lithium. So lithium just recently, as mentioned just earlier, become one of the more critical elements on the critical element list. Today, the major manufacturing of lithium, battery lithium, oh, picture disappeared. There it's back, sorry. It's mainly manufactured in South America, but also in Australia. That's where we find the most large volumes of lithium for batteries. However, in both cases, it's clear that it's a little bit different of the technologies. If we look in South America, the main source, what we see from South America, is brine. So water contains approximately 200 ppm of lithium. So that's a very good source of lithium, actually. And in South America, the method is to evaporate in huge ponds water to extract the salt. And this salt is then lithium rich, and to use this and process this into battery-grade lithium carbonate. This takes a very long time, and also, as you can imagine, you extract a lot of groundwater. And when you extract the groundwater, of course, you also affect all the surrounding villages and all the surrounding inhabitants and the nature around. So it's actually not so sustainable. So even though these methods are fairly low in carbon footprint from a process point of view, it's not really sustainable from an environmental point of view and a sustainability point of view, how it affects the surrounding areas. So in the water-sensitive areas, which you can imagine is the areas where you can actually do this evaporation, we believe that this is not so good. So we have kind of taken another route to make our batteries the greenest battery of the world. So we instead look at the hard rock deposits. And there are many, many different minerals containing lithium. I mean, one of them, which we are looking a little bit more specifically on, is spodumene. Spodumene is the most lithium-rich mineral that we can have on Earth. So we believe that this will give us the most efficient method to extract the lithium from spodumene is really the preferred route, what we look at right now. And there are many different methods, and the methods are rapidly developing as well. So there are definitely extraction methods that are sustainable compared to the old traditional methods to extract lithium from rock as well. So this is actually our preference at this very moment. Then there are an enormous amount of sustainable, interesting methods to get lithium. Also developing, and we keep our eyes on many different methods, but this is the one we are working with right now. However, even if you get access to this spodumene, the drawback right now in Europe is that we have no conversion capability at all. So even though we want to look at the whole value chain, we do have a huge gap here. And here is maybe where we want to emphasize on the political system and also on the permitting system and also on the collaborative systems. So we have many, many different small mines that we can get, where we can get spodumene. But it's hard to justify a conversion plant based on a very small resource or a very small mine. So working together and collaborate and build together is really key to make European an interesting player in this lithium value chain. So this would be valid for lithium, but actually it's even valued for all raw materials for our batteries. So for sure we have a lot of deposits, not only for lithium but also for other metals in Europe. If we work together and we build on scale, it's really possible for us to achieve sustainable methods which is also cost efficient compared to what is available presently on the world market. However, we in Europe, we have very long permitting processes, especially for mining, and this is something that we can talk a lot about, not only in Sweden, but all over Europe. So a large upfront capital and very proactive ways of working on the permitting process is needed. So a lot of political and financial support into this value chain. Clearly, if we establish in Europe, we can significantly improve traceability of our metals, and this is super key for us to be sustainable in the future. And actually, I also think that to some extent, this is an ethical question, which Europe has to take a standpoint in as well. We use approximately 25% of the raw materials in the world in Europe, but we only manufacture and supply 3%. And maybe that is not really fair at the moment. Maybe we should actually do more what we use. And of course, there is also a political agenda. So what happens if we are not self-sustaining in Europe? Of course, we shouldn't make ourselves independent of imports from other continents in the world. But maybe we should have a little bit more redundancy than we have today. And I think that the pandemic that we have seen now had made this really obvious for many of us. When imports are made more difficult, we might end up in really big problems in Europe. So to summary, I mean, battery industry in Europe and the world, of course, it's rapidly growing for EVs and for energy storages. We want to produce the world's greenest battery, and the world needs green batteries. Recycling is super important going forward, but we also need metals already from start. So recycling is not enough. We really need to go for primary sources as well. Metal availability is important for the growth of this electrification and for the more sustainable energy future. Europe has metal resources for sure, but they are rather small on a global level. So few operating mines, and by actually working together, we can make this work much better. We have good access of sustainable processing methods. So I think what we have today and also what is going to be developed within the near future, it's going to make it happen. And as well, collaboration is really key. We have to build on scale on Europe, European value chain. So with that, I want to thank you, and please stay in touch. We need each other.
So thank you very much, Maria, for that very interesting talk. Just a very fast question. So what would you say would be, you talked about the nickel chain, for example, the nickel example. What would be the biggest difficulty in obtaining a local value chain, would you say? If you were to pick one thing, what is the biggest difficulty? Is it technical or is it legislative, or where would you say that you...
Yeah. I think right now what we experienced is that along the value chain and to enable local sourcing, I think in some areas of a value chain we are very mature. In some areas we are not so mature, and in some areas we lack fully solutions. So I think establishing a value chain, making these local sourcing and local value chains, everyone has to develop at the same time to really go from A to B all the way. And it's always the weakest link that make the value chain not efficient.
Yeah.
Yeah. So working together.
Thank you. We will continue this with the discussion later. So with this, we say thank you to Maria, and we move to our next part of this interesting seminar, responsible mining. And by that, I would like to introduce our next speaker, Jennifer Rietbergen-Mccracken, Senior Advisor to the Responsible Mining Foundation. And Jennifer has also consulted for several large-scale mining companies and regional spatial development planning initiatives in Africa. And she will tell us more about responsible mining for the green transition. Welcome, Jennifer. Are you with us? I think you are muted. No.
No, I'm not muted, but can you hear me?
Oh, thank you. Now we can hear you. Yes, now we can hear you.
That's strange. I wasn't muted, but anyway, I'm glad it works now. I'll get my screen up and running then. Okay, is that clear to everybody?
Yes, we can see fine and hear you.
Okay, good, thank you. Thank you, Charlotte, and greetings to everybody participating in the webinar today. And I'd like to spend this time just sharing some results of recent research by the Responsible Mining Foundation on the extent to which large-scale mining companies are adopting responsible practices, and then to reflect a bit on what that means for the energy transition and the prospects of it being green, not only in terms of its climate impact, but its wider environmental impacts. And Maria has already pointed out with the lithium example, how it's important to look just beyond the the carbon footprint of these energy technologies. And a few words just about the Responsible Mining Foundation, if you're not familiar with it. RMF is an independent research organisation based in Switzerland and working to encourage continuous improvement in responsible mining and in responsible extractives values chains more generally. So as part of its research activities, RMF produces its biennial RMI, or Responsible Mining Index, reports. And these reports come out every 2 years, and they look from public domain data at what large-scale mining companies are doing on these 6 areas of economic development, environmental, social, and governance issues. And the assessment is made from the perspective of society expectations of large-scale mining companies on these issues. And RMF bases its articulation of society expectations on its extensive consultations that it held while it was developing the scope and the bar of its assessments. And these consultations included, for example, mining affected communities, civil society groups, and labour unions in producing countries, as well as investors, governments, and the mining companies themselves. And the assessment looks primarily at company-wide policies and practices on these issues. But there's also a smaller part of the assessment that looks at mine site level actions. Now, there's a lot of information on this slide, but I just want to show it to you and to use it to show the global scope of the RMI report. The 2020 edition that came out earlier this year covers 38 of the world's largest mining companies, including publicly listed, private, and state-owned companies. And together they account for about 28% of global mining production. So with that background, we can look at some of the results. And this chart, for example, shows the overall results across the 38 companies on the whole area of community well-being. Here we can see that even the stronger performing companies on the left side of the chart are still some way off meeting society expectations. And these expectations relate to issues such as respecting human rights, or supporting local procurement, or managing impacts around land use, gender equality, etc. And we see the same kind of pattern for the other thematic areas. On the whole, the companies show much room for improvement, despite some encouraging results and some examples of leading practice. And if you look at a few slides on what I think would be the #1 environmental risk for many large-scale mining companies, and that relates to their tailings storage facilities. And here we have a slide that shows a good number of companies scoring well on disclosing data on the location and the safety of their TSFs, their tailings storage facilities. But if you compare the heights of these bars, and I think I should have said each bar represents one of the 38 companies. If you compare the heights of these bars on this chart with the next one, we can see that when it comes to companies demonstrating that they're actually taking actions to review and improve their performance on managing their tailings-related risks, the results are considerably weaker. And still on the issue of tailings, if we look at companies formally committing not to dump tailings in river or marine environments, we can see here that only one company has made such a commitment. And in fact, 8 of the 38 companies are known to be using these environmentally damaging disposal methods. And this issue of marine tailings is actually an important one because, as Danielle pointed out, there's going to be a significant increase of demand for nickel. We've seen that the supply in the pipeline is not sufficient, and we know for sure that some of the nickel will have to come from Indonesia, where several mining company projects are proposing to dump their tailings in the deep sea. And I'm skimming through these quite quickly, but we can always go back to them if anybody has any questions. But as with tailings, we see a similar pattern when it comes to climate action by large-scale mining companies. Here we can see that most of the companies are tracking and reporting on their greenhouse gas emissions, and that's shown up in the green segments of this chart. But far fewer companies can actually show action, and that's the orange or the brown color of the bars, that they've actually taken reviews, they've undertaken reviews or audits of how effective they've been in reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. And fewer still companies can show that they've actually taken corrective action based on the results of those reviews to improve their performance in reducing their emissions. And then if we look briefly at mine site level actions, this chart shows that from all the commodities mined by the 38 assessed companies, the number of mine sites producing these energy transition minerals. And you can see that we cover nearly all, in fact, we cover nearly all of the minerals considered in the World Bank analysis that Danielle has pointed out earlier. We are missing, I think, lithium and graphite, but most of the other ones are covered here. I should say also that the RMI report covers other commodities such as gold and coal that are of course not shown here. But of those mines that produce the green energy minerals, we can look at how some of them are faring in the mine site assessment portion of the RMI report. And this assessment of mine site actions covers these 10 different areas. And what it does, it assesses the extent to which mining companies at the mine site level are sharing publicly information on these issues and how they're managing those issues, and also engaging with local stakeholders on, again, how they're managing these issues. So just to give you an example, well, before I say that, actually, I should say that 109 of the mine sites that produce energy transition minerals are included in this mine site assessment. And we can see that of those 109 sites, we can see the results here. We can see that most of them show up in the large grey segments of these pie charts, which really reflects the fact that most of the companies, the majority of the companies for most of these issues, show no evidence of informing local stakeholders or engaging with them on these issues. And here we can take one example of water quality. And we can see here, for example, that 92 of the 109 mine sites show no evidence of providing detailed information on the quality of the water immediately downstream of their operations. even though we know that companies are collecting and monitoring and collecting this information, and we know that this information is of critical importance to the lives and the livelihoods of local populations. Then moving on briefly, just to look at the social and human costs of mining. This word cloud comes from another piece of research by RMF, and it shows graphically and proportionately the level of incidence of each of these different major adverse impacts. We can see that worker fatalities accounted for by far the largest number of incidents. And according to ILO, mining is still one of the most hazardous industries to work in. And at the same time, we know from Global Witness reports that mining is also the deadliest sector for land and human rights defenders, with mining operations in several countries being associated with killings of defenders from mining-affected communities. So with all of those rather sobering results shared, I would just like to pose that question: how much is enough? How much mining is enough? And this map here comes from a recent paper in the journal Nature, and it shows the intensity of mine sites, mining activity, of those mine sites that are producing minerals for the energy transition. And so the blue and the pink shaded areas here relate to those particular mine sites. And the same researchers actually mapped the overlap between these mining affected areas and priority conservation areas. And they concluded that the increased mining to feed into the energy transition will lead to significant increases of threats to biodiversity. And in fact, these new threats to biodiversity may actually surpass the climate-related threats that are being mitigated by the switch to renewable energy. So I guess my closing word would be, and this is how you can find us if you're looking for more information about us, I would say that for sure the world does need to urgently switch to carbon-free energy sources. And for sure, mining will be needed in the foreseeable future, and even more so in the energy transition years. But we do need to urgently address the adverse impacts of mining. And we need to speed up not only the adoption of responsible mining practices, we also need to speed up the development of non-mining solutions to be able to meet that demand without huge environmental and social costs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, for that interesting speak. So it feels like we have a long way to go then, or do you see any glimpses of light that in this, I mean, in the green transition, do you see that the companies are getting maybe more concerned with all these issues, responsible mining? Or is it just that the demand is increasing so they can sell anyhow?
I think that's definitely going to be one of the major risks, is if we're going to lower expectations and lower perhaps even requirements in order to speed up the supply. But in general, I would say, energy transition aside, we have seen, as I said, some encouraging progress among mining companies. So we have done this Responsible Mining Index report twice now. The first one came out 2018 and this one this year. And in those two intervening years, we kind of mapped progress and how things evolved. And so basically across the companies, there was an average of about, I think, 17% of improvement on their performances or on their scores in the RMI report. So that could be things like that a company could have developed a new human rights policy, for example, or they could have strengthened a management system, a management standard on responsible closure, for example. So there's definitely signs of progress, but I would say in terms of the speed it has to happen at, it's still much too slow. And it's very patchy, so we're not seeing that across all of the companies, for sure.
So when it comes to what do you think is the role here of decision makers and policy makers, what would you say what do they say when they see your report? What is the opinion, from that? And do they take action? I will ask the same question as I asked to Daniele. What is the effect? Do they take action? What do they do?
So for sure, we've seen actions, and particularly, for example, those stakeholders who can influence the mining sector. The number one that we've seen actually proactively taking action on this is the investor community. And the investor community are, for example, that's the case of the tailings. Did I mention it? Maybe I didn't, but the tailings disclosure was definitely as a result of investor pressure following that Brumadinho 2019 tailings failure disaster. So that's an example of how investors can push for more responsible mining. And we've seen actually investors using the RMI report data and the framework to actually inform their engagement with mining companies. So that will definitely make a difference. We've seen some response from the companies themselves. So I think there is definitely, and we've also seen actually, good to say, clear evidence of where there are requirements in place, whether it's investor conditions or whether it's legislation from either home countries or producing countries, that companies or even particular mine sites have improved enormously across compared to what they would normally have been doing, say, in a different country or in a different corner of their portfolio. So I think we can say for sure that that's definitely having a big impact, and we need to see more of those legislations put into place.
So what you're saying is that the legislation can also be a driver for change, basically, in this sense as well.
A very powerful one for sure.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, thank you a lot, Jennifer, for that very interesting speak. I will leave the floor then to the space to our next speaker of today, Anthony Hodge, senior scholar and adjunct professor, both in Kingston at Queen's University in Kingston, Canada, as well as in University of Queensland, Brisbane. And he will tell us about bridging the gap between the need for mined materials and mining's credibility. So, welcome.
Can you see me? Can you hear me?
I can hear you very well and see you.
And can you see the presentation?
Oh, let's see. Not yet.
Okay, just hold on. Where do we go here? Funny. Strange, I can't, just hold on.
So if there is a problem, we can present it from. Now your screen is showing, so it should work.
Okay, now I've got my presentation up here and it shows sharing, but you're not getting it.
You are sharing your screen, so that's working.
But you
I can
don't
see
have
myself.
Right, but you don't have the presentation. Hold on, I'm just going to go back to this.
So we can otherwise share it from Stockholm.
Well, you can do that, but I would like to be able to rush through some of the slides. Yes. Just hold on one second here. I think there we go. Are you getting it now?
Now it's working fine.
Okay, you have it.
So I will leave the floor to you then. Tony, thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to participate in this. I think what you're doing is, I think this discussion is very, very important, and it brings. Now, can you see me? Are you still seeing my presentation?
Yes, we can see your presentation.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm getting a black screen from you. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Huh.
So you can put it in presenters mode and we will see it.
Okay, just hold on. Yeah, I don't have control over it. Okay, I think I can go. I think that now you can still see me.
Yes, and we see the presentation.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. I think that the conversation that we've had so far is a wonderful lead-in for the comments that I have, because we have very, very definitely established the need. We have very, very carefully seen an example with Northvolt of a recent company that is doing wonderfully creative things to make a difference, which I find very, very encouraging. And with the RMF conversation, we have very definitely got some clear signals that the change isn't happening fast enough on the mining industry side. What I'm going to present to you is an argument that in the end is saying we may be, in order to bring the change that is needed, and we have no choice in the, we have a choice in the end. Our choice is to do mining well or do mining poorly. And to me, that's no choice. We must do it well, and we can do it well. But I don't think we are putting the effort right now to where it's needed. And the presentations, the three presentations we just had, to me, really very, very effectively demonstrate that. We have huge resources going into technological solutions. And I would argue that the impediment for change that is needed is we are not putting the same effort into the cultural change that is needed. And when I say a cultural change, I mean a culture of an industry, and in relationship to that, the culture of the host communities who serve as the home for these many mining operations. Let me give you a context, however, first. The RMF work brings together data from 30 companies. The ecological assessment that Jennifer made reference to, I think, had 228 companies. There are something in the order of 25,000 mining companies in the world. They operate something in the order of 30,000 operating mines. That's the nature of the beast out there. We must work with the leadership companies, but even the leadership companies, what's going on when Rio Tinto, who are a tremendous leadership company on the technological side, and I would guess, and I haven't looked at the RMF data for Rio Tinto, but I would guess that they figure quite well in many of the assessments that the Responsible Mining Initiative report portrays. What is happening when a company like that can do what it did with the blasting of the Aboriginal sacred sites in Australia? Why is that going on today? That's the nature of the issue. And we must be barking up the wrong tree in some way. And that's what I'm going to share with you today, because I think we need effort put in another place. This is not a technological solution, a technological challenge requiring a technological solution. We need technological solutions to, for example, the battery issue. There's no doubt about that. But the major impediment we're facing in closing the gap between society's expectations and society's sense towards the mining industry And, and what we need to do, that gap is not going to be resolved with a technological solution. Change is too little, too slow. The distribution of costs, risks, and benefits related to mining is not fair, whatever that means, particularly when you look at the full project life cycle of mining operations, which stretch not for a few years, but sometimes for decades, sometimes for centuries, and sometimes many centuries. I would argue that our current law and regulation system, locked as it is with approvals to environmental and social impact assessment, actually locks in an imbalance in decision-making by focusing us all on bad and not demanding that we similarly demand that assessment be made of the good that will result from effective mining, and that we put the responsibility for articulating what good will be achieved and the fairness of distribution of that good, that we put the responsibility for that assessment also to the companies, which they could do very well, but which they are not asked to do right now. There's no doubt that we will need more mining in the future. That's been demonstrated. And as I say, we have a choice. Now, very quickly, I just want to make a short diversion to talk about hard and soft systems, because we're caught, in my view, in proposing and championing hard system solutions when we're really dealing with soft systems problems. What is hard systems? Hard systems are crisply defined in mathematical terms. They are what the scientist and the engineer, and I'm an engineer, they are what the scientist and the engineer is comfortable with. What are soft systems? They're not well defined in mathematical terms. They're mushy. And I have these quotes here, which I just want to read to you because they're so powerful. And unfortunately, although there is a high, hard ground where practitioners can make effective use of research-based theory and technique, there is also a swamp lower down in which lie the confusing messes incapable of technical solution. And unfortunately, it is in the swamp we find the problems of greatest human concern. These delving into the swamp requires subjectivity, judgment. And that's never a problem for those whose inclinations are towards the arts and humanities, but it can be difficult for numerate scientists and engineers whose training has always prepared them well for the mixed drama, tragedy, and farce of the social process. Mining is the generic case. It brings in a need for strong technical solutions, but mines are hosted in communities and host countries in which we are dealing with the soft social difficulties that need to be resolved. In addition to that, there is a culture of the mining companies themselves. And I was struck in listening to Maria and listening to her and thinking about the culture that Northvolt has created, or the culture that from Tesla and the culture of a company like that. These are young companies. They are vibrant. They are creating a new kind of corporate culture. Compare that with some of the mining companies who've been operating for over a century. And many of their actions, many of their cultural characteristics are based in attitudes towards development from 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago. And that needs to change. And we need to change that quickly if we are to meet the needs. Now, very quickly, a key aspect of this that nobody is dealing with very well is dealing with the long term. A mine project runs through this life cycle, and sometimes it requires centuries. I've mentioned to that. In addition to that, there is a product life cycle that we have had beautifully illustrated in Daniele and Maria's presentation. In addition to that, there is another dimension to this in that implications ripple out from the industry, drawing down from the inputs and pushing out to the outputs. This ripple effect means that a little mine, which itself may have a very tiny imprint, a tiny footprint, has reach right across the world in a remarkable way, whether that be in where its products go to or where its materials and services and people come from. I'm going to raise an issue. This is, I think, our block. We deal with technological and economic efficiency, classic. We talk about output in relationship to input. We talk about value of output really in relationship to cost of input. In the 1990s, long time ago, the concept of eco-efficiency was raised by the World Business Council and Sustainable Development, where they talked about the value of output in relationship to resource consumption and waste pollution. Conceptually, I think this is, though, where we're moving to. This is the concept of sustainability in raw terms. We are talking about human activities, and mining is a wonderful example of this, where we wish the activity to contribute to well-being of people and ecosystems at the least possible generation of stress to people and ecosystems. We want the maximum well-being for the minimum stress, taking into consideration both people and ecosystems. This is the concept that we should be driving our decision-making with. And we are, quite frankly, far from that, because the cost-benefit analyses that are generally used for decision-making, the decision analyses typically go back to technological and economic efficiency. But the people in the communities understand this concept intuitively. Observations. What is the mining's real Achilles heel? It's the question of closure. What do you do at the end? What do you do when you've finished? We're talking about operations. People think a lot about what's happening during operations, and the RMF assessment of responsibility pretty much is limited to a mine's operational phase. But I must tell you, the real issue happens after operation. In fact, the operational phase is the easy one. Things are consistent. There are rules in place. Might not like the rules, but the rules are in place. The real difficulty is what happens with closure, because what's currently happening, still happening, in spite of moves, in spite of recognizing the implications of tailings collapses, as happened recently, particularly in Brazil, there are large liabilities being left over for mining at the closure, and we are not effectively designing and operating to minimize the cost of closure, and the costs of closure are not being integrated into the price of metals. We have some fundamental issues. When you're dealing with 100, 200, 300 years, how do you assess that liability today in terms of a company's annual financial statement? Financial analysis used net present value calculations. In fact, after about 20 years or a generation, they collapse. If you put any discount rate on a net present value calculation, it will eventually go to zero. Obviously, the higher the discount rate, the faster it goes to zero. If you put a zero discount rate, it explodes to an infinity. So how do you assess the costs of activities today in terms of what it will mean to a future generation? We actually don't have the tool to do that. We don't have the tool. We're not doing that very well. We need to see mining activities, as many others, as activities which we don't really understand, and that we need to change along the way. And that the key to this, and quite frankly, the RMI reports are a step in this direction, but the key to this is observing and changing, and not just on the technical side, but on the social implications and what that requires because assessing the social implication is a values-driven exercise. It means to assess the social implications, you need to draw into the assessment process the people that will be implicated. That requires a degree of collaboration and caring for each other, which we are not very good at. And Maria, you mentioned working together. Listen, that working together theme, in my view, I think if anything came out of this, that should be the theme that comes out of this. Because when you start bringing in the host communities and the host countries, they have to be involved. And because the corporations are oftentimes reflecting one set of values, both in terms of a corporate value set meant to maximize the benefit for the company, and in terms of the national value set from where that company comes from. When you impose that on a different corporate, a different value set, a different society reflecting a different value set, the only way you can assess the social implications is to bring people together and work together. So we need to integrate. We need to develop the means to integrate alternative values and perspectives in technical decision making. And if you go back to Daniele's report, and I am hugely appreciative of that work and know many of the people involved in it. If you go back to that report, though, it's written in technical language, really for a technical audience. And if you think of taking that report and putting it out to people in communities, to the indigenous communities that stand to be affected in many countries around the world, it wouldn't be understood. The question is also, as a final little thought on this slide to leave you with, what is our responsibility in this generation moving forward if we are dealing with a 1,000-year problem? And quite frankly, I'm dealing with a problem in Northern Canada right now, where the closure costs are well over $1 billion. The mine went bankrupt in 1998, and the water treatment costs are going to go on forever. What does that mean today in terms of what this generation should hold, how this generation should be held responsible? And one idea, I think, is to draw from the Aboriginal idea of 7 generations, with this generation doing its analyses for the next 7 generations. And as you move forward, each generation pushes that out. In short, in the future, if we are to overcome the gap between the needs of society, which are mounting dramatically right now, both because of the climate change issue and because of the biodiversity issue, which, please, we cannot forget. This is what we need to be doing. We need to be testing our systems against their implications for ecosystem well-being and human well-being on both sides of the spectrum. And what I mean by that, both locally and globally. Those are the ends we need to test things against. We have a number of means to get there. We have our governance systems. We have our assessment of the success of the market, and in many places of the world still, the non-market activities of society. And incidentally, there are many non-market activities of society that are still not integrated into economic analyses. We need to test our success of that in order to generate the well-being of both the ecosystem and of people. And in doing that, there is always 3 aspects. There is always process plus substance. The substance is the matter of technology. The process is the matter of values and perspectives integration. There is always the immediate, short, and the long term, and there must be integrated into that a much greater capacity to learn continuously and feed back in so we can speed up the change process. Now, this is one example which took that kind of concept and put it into 7 questions that each operation should be tested against. And I'll leave that with you for thinking about later. But finally, I want to come to this. Bridging the gap, it really, in my view, comes to, if we are to speed up the process of overcoming the gap between societal expectations, societal attitudes towards the mining industry. And I must tell you that I worked for 7 years with ICMM and sat on the table with several dozen chief executive officers of the largest mining companies in the world. And I must tell you, they think a lot about what they're doing. They think a lot and question why it is that they are held oftentimes in such disdain by so many people. And yet, if you listen to Jennifer's presentation, look at the data out there and the cloud drawing that she shared with us, if you look at that, it's not surprising that the gap is large. It's not surprising that the cynicism exists. And in the end, this drawing, which actually comes out of work to do with nuclear waste, is, I think, where we are going to. We must create a means for integrating in technical decision-making citizens' values, ethical principles, and apply that to the design objectives of any given operation. In short, we need to see the forest and the trees, and we need to maintain a longer-term perspective. So, Charlotte, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony, for giving us very valuable insight, I would say, in this area. And I hope we will have some time to discuss it, or we will have some time to discuss it during the discussion in the end. But I say thank you for now. We have to move to our next speaker, Maria Sunér-Fleming, which is the CEO of Svemin, the Swedish Association of Mines and Metal Producers, and she will give us a Swedish perspective to end this mining session. So welcome, Maria. You are present in Stockholm, I think, at IVA.
Yes. Can you see me now? I guess so. No?
Yes.
You can only see my presentation.
Now we can see you.
Okay. Yes, my name is Maria Sunér-Fleming, and I'm the CEO for the Swedish Association of Mining, Minerals and Metals Producers in Sweden. And actually, I was going to start with a quote that has already been shown here today. But I think it's a very good quote that you actually can say to explain why do we have mines. Mines does not exist because we want to have mines. They exist because they can be very useful. The metals, the materials we produce are used in many different applications in our modern society. And what the theme today is also in actually achieving the green transformation and to achieve a low carbon society for the future. So just a reminder that if you can't grow it, you have to mine it actually, and that goes for most of the things around us in the in our environment actually. And if you look, I was going to start a little bit with the European perspective and what has happened at the EU level actually the last weeks, I would say. Firstly, we saw already in December 2019, when the EU Commission delivered the Green Deal, that they pointed out that access to strategic resources is needed to deliver the Green Deal. And you need both primary and secondary sources. So it's very interesting that we today also will talk about the recycling perspective of metals and minerals. And on the right side here, we have a map of Sweden where you can see some of these critical materials that actually we have access to in Sweden. But the EU has not stopped there. They have also, just on September 3rd, published an updated critical raw material list that was also mentioned in the introduction by Charlotte here. And that they also, for the first time actually, they put together actions connected to this list. Before they have just made the list and said that, well, These are the critical raw materials for the European Union. But now, for the first time, they're also taking action on how should we actually secure our supply in the future. And they have taken their starting point in 3 different sectors. This is maybe not the easiest diagram, but if you look at to the right side, you can see that they have started in 3 different sectors that they see as crucial for the European Union. It's renewable, it's e-mobility, but it's also defense and space sector. And then they've also listed a lot of key technologies that we need to have better knowledge about in the European Union. We have actually a lack of capacity when it comes to, like Norfolk told us earlier about, assembling batteries, for example. We also have a very low capacity on several important digital ICT products that we need in order to build our modern products and our modern society. And these are the key technologies that they have drawn from these very important sectors. And then they also, to the right side, have connected this to the materials and the risk of supply and this critical list. And what they are taking these actions, they aim to develop more resilient value chains for the EU industrial ecosystems. And I think it's very positive that you now try to talk more about the industrial ecosystems, that we can actually work this together, because we need to think the whole value chain, starting from the raw material extraction until the end product, and that we can't build our transformation to a green technology, for example, on unsustainable production of raw materials. So that is very important. And they also want to reduce the dependency when it comes to using more circularity, and to substitute, of course, also some of these products. And they want to strengthen the domestic sourcing within the European Union, and also to work together better with other countries and third-party countries. And also to underline what has been talked about just recently here, how are, for example, the mining community globally acting and performing? Well, to fully respect the international obligations is a very important part of this, actually. And this is just an example. Actually, it has nothing to do with the green transition. It's from the Air and Space, but this was the most illustrative picture that I found in the EU material, where they have gone through these different products in order to see where do you actually have different materials and which of them are actually critical for the European Union that we might have a supply risk in order to have. And as you can see, for example, this is a combat aircraft, but several of these materials that we need in order to produce these are critical, just as they are for other key technologies like windmills, batteries, etc. And EU has also looked at what share do we actually have of production in the European Union, and this is quite depressing, I would say. The one that I've circled in the top, the EU shares of production of raw material is very, very low for most of these key technologies, as you can see. For batteries, it's only 1% of the raw materials that are produced in Europe. So the only one there they say we have a little bit better, it's not bad, it's for solar cells actually, but it's not very high percentage either. So we can see that we need to strengthen these industrial value chains throughout Europe, starting from the raw materials, but also going through the processing and the component production and to the assemblies. So that's why I think the Norfolk example is so interesting, that you're looking at the whole value chain as well within your processes. So one key to this is, of course, increased raw materials from Europe. And I think I skipped this because it's been talked about, the increased need of different materials before, and there are several studies out there. So I just want to say that, of course, we notice that these metals will be key for many of the technologies. And we also saw here in the start this revised list of the critical raw materials. And something to remember is we had a dialogue with the Swedish Geological Survey just when this came, And actually they confirmed what we had also thought, that we have actually good potential for half of these materials here in Sweden, in our bedrock. But many of these are not extracted today in the Swedish mines. We are more producing the classical materials from the mining sector. So, to talk a little bit more about the Swedish perspective then. Of course, I represent the Swedish mining sector, and of course we see this development as very interesting. And we also see that there will be a greater discussion on how do we actually produce these raw materials. And we can say that already today, Sweden is one of the leading mining nations in Europe. We produce 91% of all the iron ore in the European Union. We produce 40% of all the lead, and for example, 11% of all the copper ore produced in Europe. So we are already a very big producer. And even though we only have, actually it's only 12 operating mines this year, we are a big supplier in the European perspective. And what we sometimes forget is that we also have we work very close together with the technology providers, like Epiroc and Sandvik, for example, in different kind of innovative development projects in order to find better technologies that are in the operations, for example, also carbon free. So the Swedish mining sector is already a very important sector in the Swedish economy, and also very important in the European context. Together with our Finnish colleagues, I would say that we represent the two biggest mining nations in Europe today. But in order to grow this, of course, the Swedish mining sector in Sweden would be ready to increase our operations in order to help supply Europe and the green transition with these materials needed. But there are obstacles, of course, in the Swedish context. Somebody talked here earlier about the permitting processes that are very lengthy and take very long time. And even though we see that there are some positive signs, for example, we can see that the costs for exploration in Sweden have increased just these last years. You can see a quite big increase, actually, only 2019, a very huge increase. But that is mainly due to the fact that our already existing mines have started a lot greater exploration activities than they've had before. LKAB, Boliden and Lundin Mining, which owns Zinkgruvan, are the bulk of these costs. But we see that we have several other. The middle map here is actually the current exploration permits that are valid, the active exploration permits today. And also on the right side again, you can see this one, the map that shows different of these critical materials that that Europe would need, actually. But there is also a worrying trend. We can see that these active exploration permits, there was a top in 2013 with over 850 active exploration permits, and 2019 that was down to under 600 permits. And that is also a sign of the fact that Sweden, it's not possible to start a mine, actually. So why should you come here to explore? It's only the companies that already are here and do it very close to their existing mines that would like to come and do this in Sweden. So I think we have a lot to do on the Swedish perspective in order to be able to actually help this development. But there are a lot of exciting things happening in the Swedish mining sector today. And just show you a few examples. LKAB, for example, has a very interesting project that they call REMAP, where they want to take their existing tailings in order to extract rare earth elements, among other things. And this project could actually be a very big provider of rare earth elements to the European Union. Today we are entirely dependent on import from China when it comes to rare earth elements. So this is one of the exciting projects that is ongoing in the Swedish mining sector. And we have several other, as I'm sure the audience here today is very well aware of. The hybrid, for example, the much talked about the carbon-free steel making process, but that also include actually making the mining processes carbon-free. Otherwise, you can't talk about carbon-free steel if you don't take the whole value chain. We also have two interesting projects looking at how to automize and how to make it more productive, but also to electrify the mining operations. The SIMS project and the SUM project that are very also innovative together with these other companies that are working within the sector. And then there are two at the end that I also think are a little bit responses to this discussion that we heard earlier here today. The first one is called TraceMet, where we are developing a pilot project in order to follow the carbon content and the degree of recycled material through the whole value chain, from the mines in the north of Sweden until the end product, which is in these cases, it's ABB's high voltage cables, and it is Scania's trucks and lorries. So this is also something that could be a piece of the puzzle in order to make a more sustainable mining sector in the future. And we have also just recently launched from the Swedish mining sector a work that we call Mining with Nature, which is a roadmap for biodiversity, and where we are actually trying to set quite an aggressive goal that the Swedish mining and mineral industry will contribute net positively to biodiversity in 2030 in all the regions where we have mining. So that is also a project where our companies are taking a further responsibility in order to be able to coexist better with the nature. And as it's climate that we're talking about today, already in 2018, the Swedish mining sector put forward a roadmap on how to become fossil-free, and that we see that fossil-free mining operation is possible by 2035 at the latest, I would say, because this has been revised since 2018, and the companies are now talking about that this could be even earlier, actually. And we also see that the metal and mineral processing could be fossil-free or carbon-free by 2045. So there is a lot of things happening in the Swedish mining sector, and we are actually thinking that we can be a sustainable producer of metals and minerals for the green transition and also for the modern societies in the future. But of course, we need to work with the attractiveness of Sweden as a mining nation. This is actually from a work one of the Swedish authorities that looked at the mining sector. What creates an attractive mining sector? Well, physical potential is not much to do about, but we actually have it in Sweden. We have physical potential to contribute substantially and definitely more than we do today to the need for metals and minerals in Europe. But we see that we need a lot of things around this in order to be able to deliver. We need energy supply that is carbon neutral. Electrification is a very interesting solution here in Sweden, where actually the electricity supply is carbon neutral, but we need to have that also in the future. We need good infrastructure. We need the people, the skills in order to help us to do this transformation, and we need research and innovation. But I think that what worries us the most is the enabling conditions from the political side. We see that there are a very unclear political direction when it comes to mining. We see that the permitting processes are taking longer and longer time. There has been no new mine opening according to the Minerals Act and the Environmental Act in Sweden since, I think it's 2008. So it's a very long time back since we actually managed to open a new mine. So we have a lot to work on in Sweden, but we are very confident that the Swedish mining sector can be a substantial contributor to the sustainable future and to help with the transformation away from fossil fuels. Thank you.
So thank you a lot, Maria, for that very interesting insight in the Swedish mining sector. Now we will have time to discuss this in the discussion later. Now we will move into the recycling. But I will say like this, we have a digital webinar here, and 3 hours is a long time. So I will suggest that we will have a 5 minutes break to give our speakers some time to take a small rest before the final session and the discussion later on. So 5 minutes, 17:05, we will start up again. We can prepare for the next speaker already in Stockholm and Eva, and we will meet up here in 5 minutes again. Short break to catch our breath. So welcome back again. we have now heard about mining and the need for metals. And a very important part of this is, of course, recycling. How can recycling contribute? And with us today, we have two different speakers that will give two perspectives of this. And first, I will leave the floor to Stockholm and Eva, where I hope you are ready with the next speaker, Christer Forsgren, Senior Recycling Advisor for Stena Recycling International, that will talk a bit about the recycling in the green transition from a Swedish perspective.
Hello, Christer Forsgren is my name, responsible for research and development in the group of Stena Recycling. And I would like to share my experiences with you related to how far we've come, but the conclusion is really that we have quite a distance still to go to be sustainable when handling of material. Few words of the organization. It's a family-owned company, Stena. Recycling is about 50% of the turnover of the company. And we handle about 6 million tons of material every year, and most of it goes for material recycling. But we are not very efficient, I would say, in society when it comes to handling of the resources. To simplify it, less than 5% of the value of the materials is left when it is classified as waste. And we use them very badly as well. Less than 1% of the products that we have, we use it. Like a car, it's been parked most of the time. And all the tools that we have, they all not used it as well. And to simplify it, we have this challenge that if we can buy something very cheap, someone always has to pay, either the environment, health and safety, or some governmental subsidies. That's not sustainable, of course. If we look at the legislation in Europe, of course, prevention is best. And there I think we have a lot to do. Reuse, of course, is much better than recycling. And we still dispose too much of material that we handle. If we look at some of the most important legislation, we have the Framework Directive, where we have the classification if it's classified as recycling, recovery, or disposal. And the waste definition is very unique for Europe. It's the only legislation in the world where the value of the material does not take into account. And the challenge is, of course, if you would like to transform something from a waste into a product, you have to fulfill all the requirements in REACH. REACH is very good, but it's not designed in a way that makes it easy for going from waste to product. Hazard is the way that we base our decision on classifying a product or a material. But risk is when we use the material. So we need to more go over to risk-based classification than hazard-based classification to be able to use it. And I have one good example. I brought the crystal glass. It contains 25% of lead. And if this is waste, it's classified as hazardous waste, is 0.1% of lead. And you still can drink acidic wine from this glass without getting lead poisoned. So this is more related to risk than hazard. And this goes for a lot of other materials that we handle in society. Extended producer responsibility is very good, that the producer are obliged to take care of their products and design it in a way that it can be recycled in the end of its life. But it has not developed the same way as society has developed. And to simplify, most of them have the objective to reduce the cost for the producer for the products put on market. And it should be more looking into the future. How should we handle all the aspects of responsibility? And from the communication perspective, we have this big challenge, I think, for the future. As you know, nature strives for maximum disorder, and we have more than 10 up to 20 atoms in 1 gram of material. And if you then have electrical instruments that can take very low concentrations, it's impossible to say that it does not contain or it's free from in a circular economy, because you will find everything everywhere. And that is a soft issue that we have to handle one way or the other. There are driving forces, of course, when it comes to recycling. And legislation, it could be a tax for landfilling, it could be a producer responsibility, or there are limitations on what you're allowed to do. And the other one is, of course, material value. It's much easier to recycle gold than glass, for instance. The process that we use for recycling is almost the same independent of what it is, if it's plastics, paper, metals, or whatever. You first separate something out, and it could be due to that it contains some hazardous component like mercury or PCB capacitor, or that you reuse it for other applications or as a spare part. And then you have some type of mechanical downsizing. And then you sort it with a machine and get out fractions that you can send back to society. I have a short animation where you see the car, which all the liquids have been removed. This is an example of a complex product that you need some type of downsizings to be able to sort the different materials. And you shred it, takes like 5 seconds, and then you get ferrous, non-ferrous, shred a light fraction, fines, aluminum and copper out of it. Then you use a strong vacuum cleaner to remove all the light fraction, the plastics, the textile, the foam, or whatever you have in the car. And a car is an example of a complex product in this case. And the heavy fraction contains, of course, stones, steel, copper, aluminum. Some are magnetic and some are non-magnetic, so you can separate them by the magnetics. And the other flow goes by screens, so you can use eddy current magnet to separate aluminum from copper and copper from magnesium and similar things. But of course, most of this complex products also contains both a magnet and copper, which electric motor is an example of. And that you normally take out one way or the other, manual picking or a machine. So if you start off with an old car, and this is still valid for an old car, but in the future it's more like an electronic product with 4 wheels, the ones that we get 17 years from now. So then you end up with about 70% of ferrous, 10% non-ferrous, shredded light fraction, plastics, foams and similar things, and fines fraction. So this is valid for the old products, but the new products are very different from the old products. If we look at the present situation, gold is the one that we should look for recycling, and we lose about 50% of all the golds put on market still. And the global warming potential for gold is extremely high. It requires a lot of energy required to get out gold from the mine. And then we have products like CFCs, which you destruct, which also have very high global warming potential. And there's no relation, as you see, between value and how much we recycle. So we are best at recycling ferrous, which is not, it's unnatural that, because that you can separate with a magnet. If we look at the present issues that we have, for instance, lead in copper alloys, if it's more than 0.1%, it's classified as hazardous, or a substance is a very high concern, which this abbreviation talks about. So the balance between circular economy and toxic-free will be a big challenge for the future. Another one is cobalt, which is more contaminant in nickel in stainless steel. And if it's above a certain limit, also 0.1, it could be classified as a substance of very high concern. Another area where we have already been said that we're very sensitive to import, all the strong magnets that you have in hard disk drives, windmills, all the cars, there's new electric cars now contains about 3 kilograms of neodymium dysprosium magnets. And today nothing of that is recycled. We only recycle these type of magnets from windmills, offshore-based windmills, which don't have a gearbox. and that's the reason. And the conclusion so far in EU is it's very difficult to substitute. So we should really, with the EPR system, require some recycling or recycled content in products put on market. And even production waste from producing motors is sent to China. So we are very sensitive to import in other countries. Other losses are waste incineration. In Sweden, we incinerate 6 million tons of waste. 50% is industrial, 50% is municipal. And in the bottom ash that we get out, that we cannot get out the metals from, we find about 30,000 tons of aluminum, 4,000 tons of copper, and 3,000 tons of zinc, which is put as a construction material, which means that we lose it. And if to take out the metals, to replace the losses that we get from waste incineration, we require more than 3 terawatt-hours of electricity or energy and emit 500,000 tons of greenhouse gases. This is a question, why is it similarity? Is there a similarity? What is the similarity between biomass and minerals? You might think they are very different things, but there's one common thing. They contain oxygen. And we have to remove the oxygen. If we produce plastics from saccharose, for instance, we need to remove the oxygen first. And magnesite also contains a lot of oxygen. And that we can do in different ways. Of course, we can use carbon, hydrogen gas, or hydrocarbons to reduce the metals or the raw material for plastics. If we look at the possible policy instrument that we have, public procurement is, of course, very important. So you set the requirements in public procurement to be able to change this present situation that we have. Amend the extended producer responsibility legislation I already talked about. And recycled content now will be mandatory for cars, for instance. Plastics in cars, they will have to use recycled plastics in the future, and also look at the recyclability. And the conclusion is, of course, that material recycling is very good when it comes to reducing emission of greenhouse gases. To end up, a few takeaways. Downgrading metals, you cannot, in most cases, not use the same metal for the same application again. And landfilling and incineration, the losses are significant. And it's very rare with closed loop. There's always some type of downgrading. Copper is an example where it's not. But most other metals and materials, there is a downgrading. Very little of the critical raw material are put on market are recycled. It's very rare that any of those are recycled. And it's not just in the EU, it's the same all over the world. It's even worse in other parts. In the more circular economy, even lower detection limits for contaminants, everything can be found everywhere. Are we okay with that? Or how do we handle that in a communication way? Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Christer, for giving us more knowledge on the recycling in the green transition. So would you say that Sweden have a different position than other countries, or is it the same everywhere? I mean, do we have any advantages or disadvantages when it comes to recycling?
I think we're in the front line, together with the Netherlands, Germany, and the Belgium part, the northern part of Belgium. I think we're in the front line. Compared to the US, we're far better to simplify it. Parts of Japan are good at some things, but I think we have good, and also the culture in Sweden makes it easier for us to recycle than in a number of other countries. So I think we have a good possibility.
So what would you say is the main reason then for, because I know, for example, I mean, iron and steel, we're very good in recycling in Sweden, for example. But what is the reason for not recycling as much for example, as we should?
Everything is possible. Everything is possible to recycle. It's just a matter of cost. So we have to have some driving force, and it could be EPR system, it could be legislation. There are ways to increase the recycling, but it's not for free. It's cost more than to buy it from countries where they sell it for a very low cost. So we have to have good instrument to change the situation.
Okay, thank you very much, Christer Forsgren. And by that, I will leave the floor to our final speaker of the day. So now we've heard about recycling, but to be able to recycle something, we have to think of how should it be designed. So I welcome Markus Reuter, Professor and Director at the Helmholtz Institute, Freiberg, for Resource Technology in Germany. Welcome, Markus.
Thank you, Charlotte. Can you see me?
I can see your screen, I think.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So, hello everybody. I was asked to discuss a bit of design for recycling, and I put a question mark. Is it a key enabler of circular economy? We've been doing this work for some time. At the moment, I'm working for SMS Group, which is a technology supplier in metal, steel, and copper and aluminium, etc. So the major topics are like cover and also sort of dovetail to many of the points that were made in the course of this afternoon. I'd like to give you a bit of another picture to metals, at least from my perspective. I'd like also to show how do you evaluate the system to really understand its economics and its losses. And I'll give you a few examples just to show where we are, to analyze this, and also looking at design for recycling, what is possible and what's not. On the right-hand side, you'll see a figure that I will be alluding to a few times, which is really this nexus energy materials and the actual residues creation through dilution and therefore exergy dissipation. In other words, the quality of materials actually degrading. And what impact does that, and can we mitigate that at all? And that's basically the points I'd like to make. So going to that message that was also so nicely discussed earlier is how do we make society aware of metals, which many people probably don't even are aware of in this way as the people talks. And for me, metals have always come from the past, and I'd just like to embed this story I present to you today also in my own history. My great-grandfathers were organ builders in Silesia and Poland. They built quite a number of these, and they've been survived for some time, as you can see. This one in Davids at the time. But it's a beautiful combination of materials, a harmony of alloys, obviously wind, the organist, ultimately also music. So if you look at the system and you try to harmonize that and really try to understand how fast we are getting off and hitting a brick wall, you have to analyze these systems fairly accurately to get to good numbers. And that is a good start. Just to show where we are. And obviously, there are many aspects that we have to consider, but ultimately, the facts have to be on the table to move on. So what we try to do with these Metals Association mentioned over here quite recently, how can we explain to just a layperson what the heck are metals? And here are pretty well-known companies and associations in the German environment here, where we looked at how can we explain the periodic table in a more simple way, the importance of metals, why it is important to see metals as a harmony of metals, and when do they become disharmonious so that we have to add a lot of energy to actually pluck them apart. So the usual way we look at metals on the left-hand side at the top is the periodic table, and we've tried to simplify what they are called. But basically, and this is one of the key messages as well, if you want to run the modern society, you have this base carrier metals industry, which I would liken very much as the ball bearing of society. Without it, the wheel does not turn. But what is often forgotten is that this base metal ball bearing is associated with a lot of elements. Without the base metal, the others are also lost. It was just mentioned just in the previous talk, the issue with lead, and I'd just like to point that out. Because often we are not thinking systemically and bringing the stuff together, not only the engineering stuff, I will get to that, the bigger picture as well. We sort of take a quick solution and then try to score some points, but forgetting what the impact is of this. And here we then have this metal wheel, which we developed already many years ago. But we just try to visualize that if you take out lead from the system, that would mean removing a section. If you want to produce metals, you want to recycle them, you would like to put them back into the system, you need to have it together, not like shown taking a segment out. Because if you take lead or zinc out, you take that whole segment away and it's gone. Then it also limits yourself to the recycling activity. That is, how can I bring back metals into the system at the right quality? That is, the top half of the wheel is really a dilution sort of recycling, because as it was said in the previous talk, metals pick up elements. So the only way to get to another alloy is to dilute again with pure pig iron or pure aluminium. The bottom half of the drawing is that you can really, truly sort of refine to a high quality of metals, materials again. So these have to be in harmony. And if it's not, then just talking about critical elements and that type of stuff is just hot air, really. We came up with this drawing with my Belgian colleagues. We wrote a policy note, which we also sent off to the EU. You might have read it. This is the result of uncircumspect thinking, channel thinking, just cherry picking something and then putting out legislation without having the big picture in mind. That's going back to the organ story. It's a big harmonious system that you have to be very careful about. And obviously also nature comes into that as well in a very important way. So therefore I just challenge, and this is one of the messages of the talk, but we need the infrastructure to produce the metals. If we don't have it, we'll have to obviously get it elsewhere. Perspective. So is that right or is it wrong? Well, if you speak globally, well, then obviously the playing field must be also harmonious to achieve. Ultimately, if you want to speak about circularity design for recycling, we should also have a very robust, agile infrastructure, and I mean production infrastructure there as well, to take care of it, to take care of end of life, of whatever we design. So if I just give you some indication of this fundamental role of metallurgy in a circular society, and its knowledge, and to understand the interactions of elements, compounds, not only metals and alloys, but also in conjunction with plastics. Many complex plastics mixed together in very complex functional way in products, and trying to recycle. And then maintain the quality of the material is a pretty hard task. And that was also mentioned in the previous talk. And we have to be cognizant of that and make sure that legislation does not destroy that. Otherwise, circularity, as I said, is just nice words. So I expressed these points in a recent interview and also published in the annual review, Rubis, which is the largest copper recycler globally, but also one of the key primary copper producers as well. And they published this, and we discussed the inconvenient truth of circular economy, inclusive of design. That was design for recycling. So what is possible, what's not possible? And what is the effect if we speak about recycled content of a product? I always ask, what is the role and where does the residue go? Who takes care of the residue? Where is it dumped? Somewhere in the world, in some society, then we can say as an OEM, yeah, we've got recycled content. And is that correct? And can we quantify that ultimately to show how correct or incorrect such statements are? So basically what I will then just like to show to you in the last couple sheets of the talk. What does it mean, the circular economy and the design for recycling, bringing in all the actors into play, therefore also understanding the losses of the system, also the exegetic losses, which also say something about the quality of materials and energy that are dissipated, which ultimately cost money. And I always liken that, and I used this example in the UNEP report that I was key lead author of on metal recycling. How do you recycle a cup of coffee? I put that example in there. So we are all consuming a cup of coffee, or if you do tea or whatever, but always think of it, how do I take the sugar out of it again and have the sugar in its original state to put back in a new cup of coffee? Well, that's pretty hard, as you would imagine. And so that's one of the key problems that we have in recycling. How do we deal with that? Ultimately, metallurgy plays a role in that. If you produce metals, you have to melt, you have to alloy, or you have to refine. You have to understand the mineralogy, the ore body. You have to understand as well, equivalently, the mineralogy of a product, here shown Fairphone 2, and I'll get to that a bit later on. How do you bring that all together to understand, ultimately, design of the system for recycling, design of a product for recycling, estimate, ultimately, the exegetic dissipation in that system? So the last years, we've spent some time, also when I was working in Outotec, a Finnish company, also with operations elsewhere in the Nordic countries. How do we bring these aspects together? The physics on the left-hand side and trying to understand and bring the message to society. Now, as it was said, that's a hard exercise because on the left we have physics, equations. On the right we have, as was explained so nicely earlier today, not so precise explanations or equations, as a matter of fact, to do that. But ultimately, being an engineer, I always try to bring at least the numbers to the table so we can make unemotional discussions and decisions. So this is a busy slide, excuse it, but ultimately, I've been very much involved in the last years also in the simulation platform, linked ultimately to various tools to evaluate the thermoeconomics or the exergy, the energy flows through a system in detail of engineering. I do feel that it's required if we truly want to ultimately feed also reasonable numbers into the discussion of the SDGs that were also mentioned earlier today. So this is what I'll try to show to you. I will not spend a lot of numbers and tables and stuff. I just would like to convey to you where I think we should be going if we want to have a decent discussion, how fast we are walking into the brick wall with wide open eyes. So the tools that we are just This is just for your information, just to show to you this is real, and we've developed these tools over the years. On the left-hand side, we have engineering. On the right-hand side, we have environmental footprinting. So I'd like just to show to you how we use the tool in various examples to also bring together some of the points that were made earlier today. And, well, the buzzword of the day is digital twins, but gee whiz, I've been in the industry now close to 40 years, and we've been digital twinning for as long as I can remember. Anyhow, the first example, just like to use some renewable energy examples to show to you what the real efficiency of these systems are. And then I want to deviate just to show very clearly, just having nice talk, policy, and closing the loop. It's really nonsense, if I may put it so loudly. We have to understand it to make decisions well. Now, it has always been said that it's too difficult to model these systems, but I'll show to you where we are. Here in this case, we are looking at PV. Now, you know that cadmium telluride is 5%, say, of the market, but it just shows the point. We've modeled very large systems to understand the design of a cadmium telluride PV cell photovoltaic. What is the true efficiency of that from the ore to the product and recycling? That implies we bring in all these players, the copper industry, the zinc, the lead, the recycling, cobalt, etc., back into recycling. Now, here I'm speaking design for recycling of the system, not just of the product, of the system. Here you can appreciate it's 223 unit operations, and these are not just little boxes. These are plants that would run in many hundreds of thousands of tons per annum. So it's not just Mickey Mouse, the sort of calculations. So ultimately, just to show to you what it is, so this is the depth. I know it's technical, and I know we should not just talk technical, but I'm an engineer and I like to know what the real efficiency is. That's why I'm showing this. We did this for analyzing what 2,000 square meters of cadmium telluride photovoltaics would dissipate in exergy. If you look at the system, and this is then all the different parts that can be globally distributed, various continents. Now show me the LCA database that can do that at the moment. I don't think there is. But you can look at the different bits. You can ultimately produce your PV cell over here from these processes that are all those different unit operations. Ultimately, if I do recycling, well, you know, the exergetic efficiency doesn't rise so much because you are dissipating the resource. For instance, over here already significantly over there, zinc already significantly over there. And that also adds up. And it also adds up where you actually do this. If you take this big process of 223 unit operations, so it's a pretty large plant of plants. I would place that in different places of the world, where this is the plant I showed to you. These bars are all the same because it's the same scope 1 footprint. And I would put the PV production in different places. Now, this graph really shows its message. So what are we busy with if we're doing design for recycling? Do we have the right numbers? So I won't say too much more. I would produce PVs in the Nordic countries. It's very clear. Let me go to specifically design for recycling of cars, and I've been involved in that for some time. And the question that has always been with me, how important is it to shred? Obviously, you have to shred a car because it's designed to be safe, so you have to probably rip it apart. But how modular can things be to improve the recyclability? Now, I'll get to that in this third example in a moment. So the real problem is that if you have a car, in this case, body in white, and you would shred it, you would have many particles. You're, in fact, creating a lot of exergy, a lot of surface, a lot of dust. Then you want to sort it. You never have a pure recyclate. That's where it starts. So how can you design for recycling if the body is designed to keep people safe. There will be bits and pieces going everywhere, as this is shown over here. Those bits and pieces going to gold will be the residues that have to go somewhere else over here, as well as over here. So once again, you come to this dissipation of exergy through the system, ultimately to the sludge, to the mine dump, or to the secondary residue, and you have to deal with that. So it sort of begs the question as well, how modular can you get to minimize this type of recycling? So we looked at that in a very interesting project quite recently with SIAT, as a matter of fact, and we used all these models for that. We sort of looked at various modules in this case, and we looked how the design affects the true recycling rate. Not the political one, the true one. That is all the mixtures of plastics. Can you take them apart? And does it make sense? Does it make sense to cut it into zillions and bits and then sort it again? To really understand that question. So parts were taken apart, and then ultimately we looked at it once again with a system model with pretty large. And we looked at 50 elements, all the compounds, plastics, and looked at the recyclability of these products, of these modules, sorry, so I can't obviously give you the results of it, but that is where we are at the moment, to truly understand how recyclable, truly recyclable things are, how far we can push the limit. Another interesting one we were involved in the past, a colleague and I, it's published, you can even read of it in a Greenpeace report for green design. I cannot show too much once again, but this is the Fairphone 3. We were looking at that as quite recently, and we're looking specifically at modular design and what effect does it have, and how best can we recover the materials from it. Note that there are many hundreds of materials in such a product, and they are mixed very closely together. So you can read about this once again, and I can show you some results here just by mentioning them. In the Fairphone 2 result, we were actually asked to look at what are the recyclability of different elements from the product, and we try to visualize it. Once again, reaching out to society to explain, if they are buying something, what does it mean? Being truthful to the consumer, based on good physics models, transforming it, visualizing it, and having society believe what one is presenting to them. So we also came up with the recycling rate, which is up to now not been the most popular. It's not been taken up at all, because ultimately when we did this work for the Fairphone 2, I won't mention Fairphone 3 result yet, but we were somewhere around here for the recyclability of a design for recycled product. Why is that so? It is the complex connections of stuff. We also did various processing routes, and we evaluated them. That is, we put the phone without dismantling into a furnace. We took the modules and we put the modules in different processing routes, or then we went through shredding and we sort of separated stuff again. But it did sort of come very nicely to the fore that modular design is not so bad. So one of the key take-homes here as well, and the question I still have in my mind, if you have a product, for me is it one particle that I recycle? Are that all the modules I recycle? Or do I hack it to bits into zillions of parts and then resort and then have contaminated material and then recycle it again? So the point is, for me, how many parts maximizes the recovery of materials, which will never be 100%, will probably be much less than 100%. So I leave that as well, and we can probably critically discuss that in a moment. Another one that I just would like to mention sort of in conclusion really is, and I put it in quickly when I heard the discussion earlier, that we can model rock to metal fundamentally. Can be done. And in this case, we were looking at if we would create ferroneodymium boron magnets from materials mined in Brazil relative to China. So the result is, and I'll just show that to you, is once again, we have a fair dissipation of exergy from the system. So whatever one says, recyclability will never be 100%. The efficiency, resource efficiency also not. What is once again interesting, it begs the question, where will you source your magnets from in future? You can read that in a recent Journal of Metals publication. So, to conclude, what are our actions as industry, as people also reaching out? As I've said to you, or mentioned to you previously, we're trying to put these models together and inform society. So we brought out this policy brief about lead. And I've explained taking lead out of the system will really be catastrophic for the system. We actually published this one last week on the same Socrates program, discussing once again with this criticality of infrastructure, the system, and how it reaches out to the society. And this is all part of a EU-funded Socrates project, which, for instance, Boliden is also a major partner in Sweden. So, in summary, if we start taking metals out of the system and we are losing the big picture, we are in difficulty. And look at it globally, then we shouldn't just talk nicely in Europe and then see how the rest of the world does its thing and we say we are the champions. That's not going to work. Here's a nice example as well. It just shows to you the metal Flandern, the Flandern Metal Valley, which is also part of the Socrates, which actually shows lead being part of the flow sheet. Very well-known companies over here that are involved. Take lead away and the system falls apart. So this is the final message. Here we are actually downcycling in the sense we are spiraling down because of exergy dissipation, which we have to minimize, we have to mitigate, we have to be aware of it. This is physics, this can all be verified by simulation. Not being totally pessimistic, so just let me end off a bit philosophical. Here we've got this Sintra's mystical inverted tower close to Lisbon. It has always been part of Templar myth. It looks very downward spirally, and to look at it from the bottom up and hopefully see the light in it all. So let's be honest. We can think of all kinds of tricks, but ultimately the physics tells its story. We have to listen to it. The best one that shows the quality degradation of what we do is exergy. And how do I explain exergy to society? That is the problem I'm grappling with, which I then have to harmonize to the SDGs and to society in very simple forms, but based on fact. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. And by that, I will like to invite all the speakers of today for an interesting discussion. We are a little bit behind schedule, but I think since it's been such an interesting topic for all of us, I have really much appreciated hearing all your talks. So all you speakers are welcome now to participate, but I will start by welcoming Professor and Pro Vice Chancellor Per Weihed into the discussion and start by asking you a question. You have a long experience in this field related to metals and minerals. Could you please give us an outlook, what you think upon the future based on what you have heard here today and what you think will come? So Per, we cannot hear you.
You can't hear me?
Now we can hear you.
Okay.
So,
it takes a few seconds, I guess. So
yes.
Thanks to all the speakers for fantastic presentations. And I think also congratulations to the organizers to put these good presentations on the table. I think you caught all the challenges, I think, quite nicely. It's the hard issues and it's the soft issues combined that makes a solution. I think your question, to answer that takes a lot of time. I think I wrote down 4 things listening to the presentations. Being a geologist, I wrote down exploration. There was not much discussion on the supply issues, I think, which is one extremely important issue. And I think fundamentally we need to understand and change the business models for exploration. I saw one presentation where you had the reserves estimates of the USGS. I'm not sure if it was for lithium or something. I think that's the best guess of what the supply is. But if you look at the copper figures in the data from USGS, you would actually see that even though we mine a lot of copper through the years, the resources are actually going up. And I guess you need to understand that equation a bit better. And that's, of course, related to exploration. And when there is a high demand and low stocks, the prices goes up, and then you start to explore for metals. And that will also happen to these critical metals. So if there is a high demand, and it's very likely that prices goes up, and we will start to explore for these metals, and we will find a lot of these metals. So there will not be we will not run out of these metals in the future. That's for sure. And I think another issue that I think is important listening to the talks is that there is also a general demand on top of the green transition. And if you look at the history of the demand for any metal goes up 2-3% per year. So you need to get that into the picture as well, I think, in order to understand what challenge we are facing. So that's an important message. The third thing that I wrote down was the European perspective. I think, Maria, you mentioned the European perspective a bit, but I think of all the different parts of the globe, I think we are performing worst in Europe. And you had the figures up there where we are actually consuming 25% and we produce 3-4%. And we are not producing basically any of the critical metals. That has to change. And there is, as I think Maria mentioned, also good potential in Europe. So we need to utilize that much better. And then, of course, there are a number of issues that you need to address to assess that potential. And the fourth and perhaps most important thing I wrote down is social license. So if you don't work on those soft issues and the social license for this industry to operate, it doesn't really matter what we do on technology. And I think, Tony, you spoke about this in a very nice way. So I think you need to combine all these issues and in order to be successful. And in the end of the day, if you don't have that social license, it's not possible for industry to operate. So you need to bring that much more into equation, I think. And that's a very short view or perspective from my side. So I leave it there a lot.
Thank you a lot, Per. We will come back to some of these things. I would like first to all of you then a question. And I will start with the audience with the speakers present in Stockholm at IVA. So what would you say is the biggest challenge in the material supply? I mean, if you were to name one thing, is it technical, environmental, legislative? What would be the biggest challenge? So I see you a bit, but we can start with Maria Sunier Fleming.
Am I on? Do you hear me now?
Yes. I can hear you. I can hear you, and I see you.
Okay.
As well.
From a Swedish mining perspective, I would say definitely that the biggest challenge is legislative. But that is also, of course, connected to the issue around social license to operate and the view of mining as something dirty and destroying the environment. And I think the mining sector definitely has a big task in showing something else and also taking the long perspective in actually doing mining. I think it's very interesting what Anthony mentioned and talking about the life cycle times of mining, that you need to see it in a very long-term perspective in restoring the area where you have been mining afterwards as well. So legislative and social license to operate.
Thank you. What would you say then, Christer Forskeren, from a recycling perspective? What is the biggest challenge there in the material supply?
I think I mentioned quite a lot of challenges during my presentation, but one that I didn't mention is the how clean is clean. I think we try to recycle it clean in all aspects. Some contaminants are critical, some are not critical, and that's a knowledge that we don't have today. Lithium-ion batteries is a good example, where it has to be very clean from all perspectives, but we don't know what the contaminants are critical yet, which makes recycling very expensive, because you have to clean it to a very low level of contaminants.
So Maria Åstrand.
Yeah, I got some more time to think, and I was thinking, what is the major challenge that I didn't already mention? I think I would like to lift up that speed of execution is a challenge. We see different parts of the value chain working in different speeds, and also someone raised earlier, the cultures in different organizations along the value chain is a little bit different. And I think that we need to be very timed in this one, because I think if one industry in one part of the value chain is developing really fast and the other ones don't develop in the same pace, I think, of course, we will have a deficit along the timeline. I think that's a big challenge. So to time it and collaborate on timelines a little bit better, I think that's key going forward.
So the same question to Jennifer here, Rietbergen-Mccracken. From your perspective, what would you say is this challenge in the material supply? And to do it in a sustainable way.
Can you hear me okay, Charlotte?
Yes.
Good. Thank you. So I would say, from the perspective of responsible mining, I would say that the biggest challenge I see is that this, in fact, just indeed the increased demand for the energy transition could put at risk, or could risk rather, companies taking shortcuts and governments potentially taking shortcuts too. So the companies might actually just think of ESG responsibility as an add-on and not as a necessarily core part of their business, which would be a risk both to the business and to the environments and the people on the ground around their mine sites. So that's kind of the one of the risks linked to that. But at the same time, just given that what somebody's just mentioned, given that the demand is increasing, the price will increase. This may also come into conflict with the fact that the ore grade of many metals and minerals that will be needed is actually decreasing. And so companies will be pushed into looking for those minerals and metals in less economically viable situations, and in situations which would pose greater environmental risk. So there will be much more waste produced by these low-grade operations. There's much more higher risk of unsustainable use of water. And of course, there's the whole tailings issue as well, which will be an enormous problem for these kind of mine sites that are generating huge amounts of waste. So I think those two examples perhaps are kind of some of the things we need to avoid in order to ensure that, okay, us in the maybe in Sweden, the mining industry have got none of those issues to deal with. But what we really want to avoid is us in the northern cities enjoying the pollution-free cities because of all the electric cars, but basically shifting all of those environmental, social problems to the producing countries where the mining is being increased more and more.
So Thank you. I will leave the word to Tony, and you already touched upon this, what you think is the most important, but to again for our listeners here. So what would you say again is the biggest challenge?
Thanks, Charlotte, and thank you very, very much for including me in this conversation, which has been very, very rich. There is two things, quick points I want to make. One is that, we haven't talked at all about academia, about teaching. And I think that the issues that Marcus raises in terms of his challenge of bringing how do you share the concept of exogeny to society so they understand the limitations of recycling? To me, the challenge in all of what we're talking about is enabling and enhancing our capacity to see a bigger picture so that the smaller decisions that we each have to make along the way are done in harmony. And again, Marcus, that's the word that you used, but it's come up, it's in behind many other presentations here. To me, that's the challenge. And it starts in our teaching environments because we are teaching young people to only look at the little bits when we need the little bits, but we also need to see the big picture. So Charlotte, thank you very much. That's where I would end up on.
Thank you. I will. That's very interesting. I can comment on that later, but I will leave this floor to Marcus Reuter to take. What would you say is the biggest challenge in connection to this? We can't hear you, Marcus.
Now you can hear me.
Now we can hear you. Yes.
Tony, thanks for that. You really just are leading me to what I'd like to continue from that. Because of that complexity of the bits, I think we've simplified understanding the system to such an extent that sometimes I just shake my head. And we come to erroneous results. And for me, that's a real issue that sometimes I've been told many years over the years, your models are too complex. So what I see as a counteraction, there are many people using Excel sheets. I call them the Excel mafia. So that's very, very, very difficult to do that. And then I teach simulation. I'm in industry, but I still teach simulation. And I try to convey that, to visualize the complexity, but as simple as possible to excite the young people to go out there and really go, come on, guys, just show the truth there. I think we should have a beer in Queens sometime, Tony. I would really enjoy. I've been to your university in Canada as well in the past. So, for me, that's a challenge. How do we make complex problems simple, but don't dumb them down that ultimately they don't give us a good answer?
Thank you a lot. I wish I had the answer for that, but I will leave it to Per Weihed to as the final person here today. What would you say is the biggest challenge? You already mentioned some of this, but in connection to this.
No, I still think you can hear me now?
Yes.
I hope, yeah. I still think it's the social license, and in that I also include educational aspects that you have already touched upon, but I think it's not only the youngsters that need to be educated, it's also the politicians, the decision makers, ordinary people need to understand why we have this mining and why we need to recycle and so forth, because the general knowledge on these aspects is, I think, too low. Because with this level of knowledge, we don't take clever decisions, I think, in politics and so forth. I will end. I was just, some of you mentioned if you can't grow it, you have to mine it. But I've seen that quoted quite a few times through history. But I think you can also say if you can't grow it and you can't mine it, you have to recycle it. So I think it's a combination of all these different aspects that needs to be conveyed to basically ordinary people. So, and that's part of what I think is the social license. And of course, industry also have to be a part of this, and sustainability issues, of course, are key for this to work, I think. So I leave it there.
So a question in relation to this. I mean, we tend to see many times we tend to look at primary and secondary sources as completely separate things. I mean, the reason for that might be many, but should we maybe change that, and look at them as different sources, but both will help the material supply, sort of. I mean, we have companies in Sweden, for example, that look at them as sources that they introduce in the same process. I might start with maybe Christer and Marcus to comment on that as a start.
Secondary raw material has been a word that has been used for many years, but the challenge is today that the legislation it's not possible to have that. Either we have waste and a lot of regulations, or we have a product very little regulations. And I agree, there should be something in between that you can use as raw material in many applications that does not require a lot of administration and legacy issues. So of course it would be very nice, but it's legislation perspective, it's a long journey to come there.
But you would say it's mainly more like a legislative thing, it's not an actual technical issue then, if we would change this? I
agree, it's not a technical issue.
Marcus Reuter, what is your see on this? How do you see it? So we cannot hear you again, Marcus.
Yes, sorry.
Sorry, no problem.
I can just continue where Krista ended off. If you look at the big recycling plants for e-waste, they originated from a primary smelter and then they went to secondary. So if you look at the periodic table, it's chemistry. So if people don't understand chemistry anymore and the importance, say, of lead, then funny legislation comes out there and it destroys the system. So just what Per said, we need obviously to educate a wider community, but who wants to listen to chemistry? And that's a real issue. If one doesn't understand that complexity of how materials react in a system, then it's hard to explain why, if you take lead out of the system, then you collapse the system. That's a hard statement, but that's true. And we have to be very, very careful of that. And therefore, informing, and that's why the figures that I've shown were, and I actually drew them with my Belgian colleagues in Leuven, to convey to politicians exactly what Per said, that message. Chemistry we understand, we can do the flow sheets, but we must get the flow sheets in Europe if we want to do them, not make it impossible for put them here. We understand the chemistry, but less and less, because the technology is happening more and more elsewhere in the world. That's a threat. And so I think Walter, the talk on the batteries earlier for Maria, well, it's so important that we bring that gravity back here. Then policy, chemistry will come together in a better way, which I think is perhaps not at the moment as good as it should be.
So how do you, I mean, this is related to this, but also in a broader context, because in general, I would say we are still, in particular, maybe the mining industry is suffering with a not in my backyard problem. So I mean, here in Sweden, we tend to use a lot of metals, but we might not, or many think that we should not have a mine. How do we deal with that? Do you have any solutions to give me now for that?
Me?
Yes. No.
I'll give you one.
I was directing the question maybe to Tony. You can start.
Okay. No, Tony, please. I ought to be able to talk all night on this one.
Yeah, but listen, the center of gravity is not just going to move back to Europe. I'm flummoxed by this because here I sit in Victoria, and you might have noticed that the sun just came up over here. And I think the center of gravity, to some extent, it will move back there because the effort of you people and many others is taking it there. But it's not going to last. It won't go there forever. And so I think we have to look even on that issue at the bigger picture and look at ways of bringing security, working with partners in Africa and South Africa and South America, rather, and North America and Asia and so forth, and working with partners in a way that is more honorable and more secure. So yes, we do come back to the political system there, which is in a state of turmoil at the moment. But that's where we have to go ultimately, I think. So once again, I come back to seeing and working with the bigger picture, and the technological people like myself and like Marcus and the others on this panel and the others who helped create this panel and so forth, I think have to be willing to enter into, and I don't mean be elected, but enter into debate and discussion in the political realms in order that the conversation about the issues that have been raised here are in fact taken into the public regime in a palatable way. We have not been very good at that. Let's face it. The mining industry is recognizing that. The mining industry is trying to do that. But there's another reality, and that is that you can't tell your own story yourself because it's self-serving. So others have to speak about this. And these are difficult issues. There's no doubt about it. So Charlotte, that's my little addition.
So Jennifer, I mean, from the Responsible Mining Foundation perspective, how do you see this? So you are muted, I think, Jennifer. We can't hear you.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
I was just saying this is maybe the Responsible Mining Foundation's position, but personally, I think there's a huge opportunity for mining companies to get involved in secondary production issues. So I think this ties in with the whole issue of material stewardship, which has been on the table for quite a long time. I think there was even a guideline put out by ICMM back in 2006, but nothing's really happened on the ground very much since that. But I've seen a couple of companies who are actually getting involved and kind of changing their business model to actually do both, to mine and recycle and sell metal from both their sources. So I think that's a good start. And I think there's much more to be done to involve mining companies in non-mining solutions. Well, that sounds kind of contradictory, but they can go all the way down to working with their manufacturers to buy their commodities and see if they can develop together based on the mining company's own technological know-how and recycling experience to support manufacturers to develop processes that are less mineral intensive or to produce products that are more example, going on back to Marcus's point. There's a lot of opportunity there that can be harnessed and encouraged to go in that direction. So we're not looking only at either mining or recycling.
So I would like Maria Åstrand to comment on that. I mean, your company is doing both, or that's the idea with the value chain. So could you comment on this perspective as well?
The not in my backyard perspective.
Well, both that, but in connection then also to how we see secondary and primary resources, because I think it's a bit connected also.
Yes. And as mentioned, I mean, an industry growing up really, really fast now as the lithium ion or the battery in general business for vehicles and for energy storage. Of course, it is not enough to use secondary material, if we call it that. So we really need both. But I think that the driving force to make a so sustainable and so cyclic industry as possible as we can do, basically building it from start. I think we all are responsible to do that. I do want to emphasize on something, though, that we heard earlier also that sometimes reuse could be beneficial or maybe to prefer before recycling. And I think that is really a valid thing. So when you go in the recycling ladder, you should always try to reuse as much as possible. But in this specific case, developing new products like lithium-ion batteries, I think that the technology and the performance of lithium-ion batteries is developing so fast right now. So to lock in these atoms into cells, into batteries, with a certain chemistry and a certain performance and capacity, and not being able to access those to make a new chemistry, I think that might actually be a little bit like biting ourselves in our own tail. So to some extent, we need also to make very fact-based decisions on when recycling is actually, in this industry, better than reuse, as we want to increase capacity and increase the let's say, the benefit per ion from the battery. Yes. Yeah, so it's a balance.
So how do you I mean, you are a company that most look upon as a very good example of this, but how do you deal with the not in my backyard problem, or is that how do you see this?
It's a super tricky question, as Jennifer raised. It's really one of the more important ones, and I can just go back to myself in my life and with my family, and realizing that having someone else telling the good sides, as Tony mentioned, having someone else telling the story on when it's actually successful and working well, maybe this is a very important thing, that we learn from people that have own experiences in this case. And also, I mean, having companies that wants to go into areas close to smaller cities or even villages. I think that these companies, if they are fair and true and honest on what they are going to do, maybe we don't have to think about the worst case of mining that we have seen on news or seen before, but actually understanding what is modern mining. How does it look like? And if these companies are true and honest and close to the societies, of course, this is the best case to have mutual understanding of what does it mean to have a mine close by. Maybe it's not all that bad.
So, do you think this is getting enough attention? A final question yet here before. One final question. Is this getting enough attention? I mean, we that have gathered here today, we all see this as a critical issue, but is it getting enough attention? Per, maybe could reflect upon that.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, the short answer is no. Absolutely. I think this is one of the grand challenges for humankind. We are getting in the next 30, 40 years to 3 billion more people on Earth. And material supply is going to be an absolutely critical issue. So it's not getting the attention it should.
So thank you, Per. And I see Gert here waiting. So I would like to say thank you to all of you and for participating today. And then Gert Nilsson, chairman of our division, will summarize this with some concluding remarks.
Thank you, Charlotte. Well, as chairman of the Metals and Mining and Materials Division at the Royal Academy of Engineering Sciences, I just want to thank you all for an outstanding seminar. I think we have learned a lot. I would particularly like to thank you speakers from all over the world who went up very early and took your time to be with us today and share your experiences. I think that was very interesting. I don't think I need to summarize much more, Charlotte. Per did that and you did that very well. I think, though, that we ended on a note where we listed a lot of challenges ahead. I just want to remind you about the findings of Daniele Laporta initially, when she said that the more ambitious a climate policy you want, the more you need to mine. That tells me that whatever challenges our endeavor entails, the alternative entails more. Keep that in mind. And then I just want to end this by stealing a quote from Maria and say, stay in touch. We need each other. Thank you very much.